Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're stepping into one of those eerie crossroads where modern fairy tale glamour brushes against the dust of Tudor crypts. You picture yourself drifting down a candlelit corridor, walls damp with 500 years of whispers, when suddenly a familiar face flickers from the shadows. Princess Diana, radiant, tragic, beloved, doesn't stand alone. Behind her, pale ghosts of Tudor kings and scheming queens crowd closer, their legacy tangled into her veins. That's the hook of tonight's tale, the hidden sinister thread of Tudor blood winding its way through Diana's lineage. You might imagine royal blood as golden and noble, but often it carried poison, ambition, curses, madness, and betrayal. And if you've ever struggled to survive one chaotic family reunion, trust me, you probably wouldn't survive this dynastic one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to post your location and local time in the comments. It's always strangely magical to see where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the threshold of Diana's story, but to walk forward you must walk backward, back to the smoky halls of the late 15th century, where the Tudors rise from the ashes of the Wars of the Roses. Imagine the battlefield of Bosworth in 1485, where Richard III falls, famously losing not just his crown but his horse, his kingdom, and eventually his life. Henry Tudor, a man who'd spent much of his youth hiding in Brittany, suddenly becomes Henry VII. He has shaky claim, but the chaos of civil war lets him plant his banner in the mud. The dynasty begins in blood and uncertainty, and you already sense the same aura that would later cling to Diana. Beloved by the public, but haunted by forces larger than herself, you can hear the scraping boots of courtiers as they scramble to pledge loyalty to this new ruler. The Tudor dynasty, for all its splendour, is built on fear of collapse. Henry VII knows this better than anyone. His marriage to Elizabeth of York is not just a romantic union. It's a calculated move to unite two warring houses. Out of this union, a fragile peace blooms, but the roots of paranoia remain. Henry guards his throne like a nervous cat with one eye open, wary of pretenders like Perkin Warbeck. You picture the king slipping coins into his robes at night, ready to bribe or bristle against betrayal. And here's the sinister twist. Those who descend from this fragile union carry not only noble prestige but also the gnawing anxiety of legitimacy. Diana's bloodline snakes back to these very halls. Hidden within her ancestry are noble houses that orbited the Tudors like moths around candle flame, sometimes basking in warmth, or often burning to ashes. Now you lean closer to the shadows and glimpse the echo of Henry VII's court. Tapestries heavy with heraldic beasts, spiced wine poured in silver goblets, and the constant hum of rumour. In that world, family was never just family. It was power, chess moves, and survival. That's a lesson Diana would unknowingly inherit centuries later, when her marriage to Prince Charles became less about romance and more about dynastic duty. The Tudors set that pattern, where love bent beneath the iron spine of lineage. Historians still argue whether Henry VII was a miserly accountant of a king, or a shrewd architect who saved England from endless war. What's certain is that he planted seeds of suspicion so deep that even his descendants couldn't escape them. And you, tracing Diana's ghost thread, feel the chill of that suspicion. Did her charm, her beauty, her uncanny ability to capture hearts come laced with the same Tudor gift for survival in hostile courts? Or was it the Tudor curse of being devoured by those same courts? Consider this quirky tidbit. Henry VII's personal emblem was the Tudor rose, a hybrid of red and white symbolising peace between Lancaster and York. Yet in the centuries since, gardeners joke it's one of the most stubborn roses to cultivate, prone to rot if overwatered. Imagine Diana, often called England's rose, linked not only by metaphor but by literal bloodline to a rose that never thrives easily. Coincidence? Or another whispered curse curling up from Tudor soil? As you wander deeper into this haunted corridor, your candle sputters, and from the gloom steps a familiar figure. Henry VIII, larger than life, belly strained against velvet, eyes glittering with appetite and insecurity. His ghostly laughter shakes the rafters, reminding you that every Tudor carried shadows Diana could never quite escape. You already know where Henry's story leads. Wives discarded like broken jewellery, religious upheaval tearing through Europe, a dynasty obsessed with heirs at all costs. And somewhere down that branching tree, far from the throne but still tangled in its roots, the Spencer family emerges, weaving Diana's story into Tudor fabric. But let's not rush. For now you linger in Henry VII's reign, where every banquet feels like a test, every smile might hide a dagger. You sip the warm wine of his court and taste iron underneath. The Tudors are secure, but only just. You realise Diana's world, centuries later, isn't so different. Cameras replace courtiers, tabloids replace jesters, but the scrutiny remains. You stand always in the spotlight, expected to smile while shadows gnaw at your heels. Picture yourself leaning against the cold stone, eyes half closed, lulled by the droning of minstrels. Somewhere in the background a noble child coughs, perhaps with the sweating sickness that swept through Tudor England like a phantom thief. Families feared it more than plague, for it struck suddenly, healthy in the morning, dead by nightfall. You shiver, remembering that Diana herself would one day fall victim to sudden catastrophe, a car crash ripping her from the world with Tudor-like abruptness. It's as if history replays in cruel echoes, each century dropping the same curtain. There's another eerie thread to pull. In Tudor times, prophecy and astrology were as trusted as law. Kings consulted star charts, queens clutched talismans. Henry VII himself was said to have feared celestial omens. Imagine Diana, decades before her own death, visiting psychics and confessing to friends her fear she wouldn't live past 40. Was that intuition, modern superstition, or an echo of Tudor blood remembering its own fate lines? As your candle burns lower, the whisper grows louder. This dynasty was never just about crowns and ceremonies. It was about survival, fear, and the delicate balance between love and duty. And Diana, centuries later, became the embodiment of that struggle. You see her ghost standing beside Henry VII's, both figures smiling with the same weary knowledge. To be adored by the people is not the same as being safe from the palace. The corridors twist again, and you're led to a great wooden door. Behind it lies the rest of the dynasty. Henry VIII's thunder, Elizabeth's iron will, the Grey sisters' tragic gamble. But already, with only the first steps taken, you sense that Diana's blood carries more than blue dignity. It carries curses, compromises and shadows that have never truly died. You hold the flickering light a little tighter. The journey is only beginning, and you'll need more than courage to make it through. You push open that heavy door, and the stale air of a royal council chamber greets you. The long oak table stretches before you, scarred by years of feasts and arguments. Candles drip wax down brass holders, and shadows twist across the faces of the men gathered around it. This is where the Tudor web of power begins to weave itself, where Henry VII's fragile claim becomes something harder, sharper, and far more enduring. You can almost hear the scrape of quills on parchment as treaties are signed, and the quiet cough of courtiers calculating how best to survive. The Tudors don't arrive in England as an unstoppable dynasty. They arrive half by luck, half by ruthless calculation. Henry VII, wary and lean, knows that every decision can mean the collapse of his line. So what does he do? He marries Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting Lancaster and York in a political marriage that's less romance and more survival. In that candlelit union, the two rival roses twine together. The courtiers sigh with relief, but beneath the embroidered fabrics, you sense the stitches holding the dynasty together are already under strain. You glance around that table again and notice the players who will shape the Tudor legacy. There's Thomas Stanley, the stepfather who conveniently switched sides at Bosworth, tilting the battlefield in Henry's favour. His loyalty remains slippery, and you realise that Tudor stability depends on men like him, ambitious opportunists with one hand on the crown and the other on a dagger. Historians still argue whether Stanley's betrayal of Richard III was patriotism or pure self-interest. Either way, you understand why Henry never fully trusted his allies. This is the heart of the Tudor web, power not secured by blood alone, but by carefully arranged marriages, confiscated lands, and a ruthless grip on the nobility. The king introduces bonds and recognizances, financial traps that force noble families into obedience. If you thought late-night subscription fees were bad, imagine owing your monarch thousands of pounds just for the privilege of staying in his good graces. One wrong move, and your fortune is gone. That paranoia seeps down through generations, a lingering perfume of suspicion that Diana's bloodline would inherit centuries later. Here's a quirky tidbit. Henry VII was so obsessed with securing alliances that he once tried to marry off his daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland, despite knowing full well that centuries of border wars made that union shaky at best. But it worked. That marriage planted the seed that would later unite the English and Scottish crowns. Without it, there might never have been a Great Britain, and Diana, centuries later, might have inherited an entirely different destiny. Now, look closer at that web. Each strand glistens with risk. The nobility, once powerful warlords during the Wars of the Roses, find themselves muzzled under Henry's cautious gaze. Their private armies are dismantled. Their banners, once flown on bloody battlefields, now hang limp in dusty halls. The Tudor crown demands loyalty, but always suspects treason. You can almost feel Henry's eyes following you as you move through the chamber, calculating, weighing, never fully at ease. The web stretches further still. Across the Channel, foreign monarchs watch England like hawks. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, dangles its daughter, Catherine of Aragon, as a potential bride. France looms large, powerful and unpredictable. To keep his throne secure, Henry plays diplomacy like a chess master. Each treaty is another silken thread woven into the web, pulling his dynasty tighter into Europe's orbit. Diana's bloodline doesn't just descend from English nobility, it carries these continental threads as well, tangled with ambition and betrayal from Madrid to Paris. As you step deeper into this web, you catch the faintest flicker of another ghost. Diana herself, wrapped in a shimmering gown, standing beside Henry's courtiers. She tilts her head, almost amused. She knows this game. After all, her own marriage centuries later was arranged with dynastic calculation, her personal desires treated as secondary to political necessity. It's the same trap Elizabeth of York walked into, the same one countless Tudor women endured, a smile masking the iron weight of duty. And here's where the story takes on its sinister tone. The Tudors didn't just control through politics, they used spectacle, pageantry, and fear. Imagine the Tower of London, its walls slick with rain, looming over the city as a reminder of what happens to traitors. Inside its dungeons, nobles shiver, accused of plotting against the crown. Some are guilty, many are not. The web tightens, and once you're caught, escape is nearly impossible. That web doesn't just hold, it strangles. You can almost hear the distant cries of prisoners echoing beneath your feet. But the web wasn't only spun with iron and fear, it was spun with marriages that ripple forward into Diana's time. Families like the Spencers, the Boleyns and the Howards all find themselves drawn into Tudor schemes, sometimes willingly, sometimes dragged. Their children are pawns on a chessboard where the king always wins. When you trace Diana's ancestry, you find these names glowing faintly, like embers still smouldering centuries later. They remind you that she was never truly outside the Tudor game. She was always a player in it, whether she realised it or not. Historians still argue whether Henry VII was a cold manipulator or simply a man terrified of losing what he had fought to win. But his legacy is undeniable, a dynasty that survived by weaving one of the most intricate webs of control England had ever seen. And you, wandering through the dim corridors of his court, realise that Diana's own life was haunted by similar webs, of press, of public opinion, of family duty. She too lived in a net she could never quite escape. You stop at a window overlooking the Thames, where torches flicker along the banks. The air is heavy with smoke, the scent of tallow and river muck mixing unpleasantly. In that moment you sense how precarious everything is. One storm, one betrayal, one unlucky heir, and the entire Tudor edifice could crumble. And yet, through cunning, marriages and fear, it endures. That endurance is the legacy Diana inherits, not just blood, but the ghostly reminder that power always comes at a cost. And just when you think you've mapped the entire web, another thread glints in the darkness. It leads forward, out of Henry VII's reign, into the thunderous footsteps of his son. Henry VIII, with his booming voice and insatiable hunger, is waiting for you. The web will twist even tighter under his rule, pulling families and eventually Diana's own ancestors into a storm of ambition, betrayal, and tragedy. Your candle sputters again, and the council chamber fades into shadow. But the web lingers, sticky and suffocating, clinging to your sleeves as you move forward. You can't shake it off, not yet. The floorboards creak beneath your feet as you follow the faint glow of torchlight down yet another stone corridor. The air thickens, and the scent of wax and damp iron lingers. You've left the cautious, calculating world of Henry VII behind, and now you step into the roaring storm of his son, Henry VIII. Here, the Tudor web of power doesn't just hold, it thrashes. And you, standing in the shadow of the most infamous monarch in English history, feel the walls vibrate with both triumph and tragedy. You hear the echo before you see him, a booming laugh, broad and brash, echoing like thunder down the halls. When Henry VIII appears, he does so not as a man, but as a force of nature. Imagine the weight of velvet robes heavy with jewels, the broad chest straining against gold-threaded fabric, the sharp eyes scanning for loyalty but expecting betrayal. This is not a king who quietly manages his dynasty with bonds and financial traps like his father. This is a king who reshapes everything, politics, religion, even the course of European history, around his hunger for heirs. You linger in the great hall where minstrels pluck nervously at strings and courtiers laugh too loudly at his jokes. Yet beneath the surface of banquets and jousts the entire court trembles. Why? Because Henry VIII's obsession is singular, securing a son to carry the Tudor line forward. Every decision, wars, marriages, executions, circles back to this burning desire. His queens are less wives than chess pieces, and when they fail to produce, they are replaced, often at the cost of their lives. You probably wouldn't survive this court for a week. Step one toe out of line, whisper the wrong word, or simply fail to bear a son, and the tower awaits. It's a lesson Diana, centuries later, would eerily mirror, adored by the public but judged by the crown for what she could not, or would not, deliver. The ghostly forms of Henry's 6 wives drift into the chamber. Catherine of Aragon, patient yet humiliated. Anne Boleyn, sharp-eyed, whispering promises of sons that never came. Jane Seymour, fading in childbirth even as she finally gives Henry what he craved. Edward, the long-sought male heir. Each figure wears a crown of sorrow, and each lingers in Diana's bloodline story in indirect but sinister ways. Historians still argue whether Henry's desperation for heirs was paranoia or necessity. After all, the Wars of the Roses had taught England what happens when succession is unclear. Chaos, bloodshed, civil war. But Henry's brutal quest for stability left the dynasty more unstable than ever. By the time his life drew to its swollen, ulcerated close, his heirs were set on a collision course with one another, and the Tudor name was stained with tragedy. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you pause. Henry VIII, despite his obsession with producing children, may have carried a rare blood type, Kell positive, that could have caused repeated miscarriages and infant deaths in his partners. If true, the very body of the king sabotaged his dynasty, even as he blamed his wives. Imagine that irony. A monarch who moved heaven and earth to produce heirs, undone by the invisible currents of his own blood. And if his descendants carried fragments of that legacy, how many faint shadows of it reached down to Diana? Could her own struggles with fragile health, eating disorders, and the crushing demands of fertility in her marriage be faint echoes of that Tudor curse? Step closer to the fire and watch Henry's children take their places. There is Edward VI, sickly, pale, coughing in his bed. His reign lasts only a breath before death snatches him at 15. There is Mary the Ron, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, remembered as Bloody Mary for her persecutions, haunted by phantom pregnancies that never brought her an heir. And then Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, brilliant, imperious, but childless. Together they form a dynasty that seems unable to carry itself forward. You sense that the Tudors, for all their power, are doomed to burn out rather than fade. And here you glimpse the reflection of Diana again. Just as Henry's heirs lived under the crushing pressure of expectation, to survive, to reproduce, to secure the line, so did Diana. Married into the Windsor dynasty, she found herself judged not as a woman, but as a vessel, tasked with producing heirs to secure a throne. Her success in bearing William and Harry won public adoration, but it never shielded her from the same relentless scrutiny that destroyed Tudor queens. The camera flashes might as well have been axe blades. You trace the family tree downward, and here the web tangles again. The Howards, ambitious and ruthless, provide wives to Henry and Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn, both executed. The Seymours bask briefly in triumph before Jane dies in childbirth. The Greys, tied through marriage, will gamble and lose everything in the next generation. Every noble family drawn into Henry's desperate search for heirs either rises or falls dramatically. Diana's ancestors, hovering on the edges, are never far from danger, always a heartbeat away from being pulled into the carnage. You pause in the gallery of portraits, candlelight flickering across oil-painted faces. Henry stares out from Holbein's masterpiece, broad shoulders exaggerated, legs planted like tree trunks. But look past the bravado. The eyes reveal something else. Insecurity, desperation, maybe even fear. This is a king who knows his dynasty could collapse as easily as it began. That fear feeds every brutal choice he makes, and you, standing centuries later, see how that fear echoes into Diana's life, where the monarchy once again feared instability and used her as both symbol and scapegoat. Consider the eerie symmetry. Henry remakes England's religion to secure his heirs, shattering ties with Rome. Diana remakes the monarchy's relationship with the public, pulling it toward empathy, openness, and vulnerability. Both left institutions transformed, both paid with personal suffering. You glance down at the floor and imagine the ghosts of discarded heirs crawling across it. Stillborn children, lost pregnancies, dead teenagers. The Tudors were drenched in this silent grief, even as they projected power and magnificence. Diana too walked in grief. Miscarriages whispered about, loneliness endured in gilded palaces. The echo is too sharp to ignore. Historians still argue whether Henry's quest for heirs saved England from another civil war or merely planted seeds of future conflict. What's certain is that his obsession left scars that rippled through every branch of his descendants, scars that centuries later reached Diana's bloodline. The air grows heavy, and you sense the chapter closing. Henry VIII, bloated and raging, fades back into shadow, his laughter cracking like thunder one last time. Around you, the spectres of his heirs dissolve, leaving only silence. But the silence is not peace. It's the hush before the next storm, the rise of a queen who will rule alone, without husband or child, forcing the Tudor bloodline into ever more twisted knots. You steady your candle, heart racing, because you know where this corridor leads. It leads into Elizabeth's chamber, where the Virgin Queen sits crowned but childless, the future of the dynasty trembling in her grasp. And you know already, her choice not to marry will ripple forward into Diana's destiny centuries later. You climb a winding staircase, the air cool and dry as if time itself holds its breath. At the top sits a throne room bathed in pale light. There, in a glittering gown of gold and pearls, Elizabeth I waits, imperious, ageless, and utterly alone. The Virgin Queen gazes at you with sharp eyes that betray neither warmth nor weakness. Her presence dominates the room, yet behind that radiant facade lurks the chilling truth. She has no heir. For the Tudor dynasty, this is not just a personal choice. It is a looming catastrophe. You hear the rustle of silks as her courtiers shuffle nervously in the background, whispering about suitors. Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, all parade princes before her like a bizarre royal dating show. But Elizabeth resists time and again. You can almost feel her steel resolve. She will not submit her crown to the will of a husband, nor risk the turbulence of childbirth that claimed so many Tudor women before her. And in that refusal she forges a throne that glitters with power, but trembles with fragility. You imagine the weight of her crown pressing not only on her head but on the entire dynasty. Without children, the Tudor line will sputter to an end. You glance at the painted ceiling above, where cherubs hover in fresco, mocking the irony. The greatest queen of England's golden age will leave no children to carry her blood. Diana's life, centuries later, hums with a similar contradiction. Beloved for her independence, for her ability to command hearts, yet forever bound to a monarchy obsessed with heirs. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's refusal to marry was pure political strategy or a deep personal wound. Some say she never recovered from the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and therefore distrusted men and matrimony. Others suggest she wielded her singlehood like a weapon, keeping European powers dangling in uncertainty, always vying for her favour. You stand there, candle flickering, and realise both could be true. A woman's private grief and a queen's public cunning intertwine until they are impossible to separate. Here's a curious tidbit. Elizabeth often referred to herself as being wedded to her kingdom. In ceremonies, she even wore gowns styled like bridal dresses, marrying herself symbolically to England. Imagine the scene. Courtiers gazing, bells tolling, as if the entire nation is her groom. It is both theatrical and profoundly sad. Beneath the spectacle, you sense the ache of isolation. To rule meant to be adored by millions, yet never held by one. Diana, in her own lifetime, knew this sting well. Loved by a nation, but abandoned in private. The throne room itself seems to shimmer with contradiction. On one hand, Elizabeth presides over triumphs, defeating the Spanish Armada, nurturing a cultural golden age with Shakespeare and Spencer. The world bows to her majesty. On the other, every banquet, every court masque, every dazzling progress across the countryside is haunted by the silence of a nursery that never filled. You walk down a gallery lined with portraits, noticing that none show her with children or heirs. Instead, they present her as an eternal goddess, ageless and untouchable, immortal in image, mortal in blood. Now, imagine the ripple. Because Elizabeth leaves no heir, the Tudor bloodline scatters into hidden branches, weaving into the families of cousins, nobles, and rivals. It is here that Diana's ancestry quietly entwines. Far removed from the throne, tucked into the tangled marriages of minor aristocracy, the Tudor legacy continues to trickle, a thin thread, almost invisible, yet strong enough to reach into the 20th century. Without Elizabeth's choice, Diana's bloodline might have diverged entirely. The Virgin Queen's independence reshaped not just England's destiny, but Diana's as well. You pause by a window and gaze out over the Thames, where ships' masts bristle against the horizon. Merchants shout, the scent of spices and salt hangs heavy, and you hear the bustle of empire being born. Elizabeth's England grows powerful, outward-looking, but at its core remains brittle. Everyone wonders, who will inherit? Which cousin, which distant kin, which rival claimant will step into the vacuum when she dies? That uncertainty gnaws like rats in the walls. Diana's story too was haunted by succession, not of thrones but of roles. Would she be queen? Would her sons? Would the monarchy even survive the glare of modern scandal? The irony sharpens as you study Elizabeth's jewellery, glittering with symbols. She wore pearls to signify purity, rubies to show power, and often a serpent-shaped ring said to remind her of the wisdom and eternity. Yet none of these could ward off the fate that awaited. Her line extinguished, her throne passed to the rival Stuarts. Imagine her in her last days, frail, sitting beneath tapestries of lions and roses, whispering to courtiers that she saw herself made of stone. No heir to comfort her, no child to hold her hand. You shiver, because centuries later, Diana too would die alone, the world adoring her but unable to protect her. Here's a quirky historical echo. Elizabeth's closest relationship may have been with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Rumours swirled of secret marriage, even secret children. None were ever proven. Yet the gossip refused to die, just as Diana's supposed affairs, friendships, and heartbreaks fueled endless speculation. Both women lived under the magnifying glass of rumour, their private selves consumed by public curiosity. Different centuries, same hunger. The childless throne does more than haunt Elizabeth, it haunts England itself. Without a direct Tudor heir, the crown leaps sideways to the Stuarts, bringing Scotland's James VI south as James I of England. That union of crowns, celebrated and feared, changes everything. You sense how precarious the line was, how easily England could have descended back into war. Elizabeth's womb was not just her own, it was the vessel in which the fate of nations rested. When she chose to leave it empty, history itself shifted course. You lean against a cold pillar, heart heavy, because you realise the pattern repeating. Women in Diana's bloodline were never truly free. Whether they bore children or refused, they carried the crushing weight of dynastic expectation. For Elizabeth, it meant eternal solitude. For Diana, it meant marriage dissected by tabloids. Her worth measured in heirs produced. Different masks, same chains. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's reign marks the true zenith of Tudor power or the beginning of its unravelling. But for you, Wandering through this spectral throne room, one truth shines. Her refusal to marry, her decision to rule alone, created the fractures that forced Tudor blood into sidelong branches. And those branches, twisted through centuries of noble marriages, would eventually sprout Diana. She is, in part, Elizabeth's legacy, not in crown or power, but in the haunting loneliness of being adored yet unprotected. The room darkens as Elizabeth fades back into the shadows, her golden gown dissolving into dust. The throne stands empty, its cushions cold. But the silence it leaves is not peace. It is the tense pause before the scramble. Who inherits? Who dares claim the prize? You sense the next storm already building, and you know it will tear apart another branch of Diana's ancestry. The Grey sisters wait in the wings, their gamble for the crown about to burn their family forever into the tragic heart of Tudor history. You steady your breath, the echoes of Elizabeth's solitude still pressing on your chest. The corridor stretches forward again, torchlight flickering, drawing you toward the doomed footsteps of Lady Jane Grey and her kin. Diana's bloodline has no intention of letting you rest yet. The corridor ahead narrows, stones sweating with damp, the air carrying the faint metallic tang of fear. You step into a small chamber and at once sense the shift. Gone are the glittering triumphs of Elizabeth's court. Before you now rise the pale, flickering shadows of the Grey sisters, their fates bound by ambition, desperation, and blood. In their story lies one of the most haunting gambles of Tudor England, and in their veins runs the same current that centuries later winds down into Diana's ancestry. You hear the faint scuff of slippers on stone as Lady Jane Grey appears, her figure slight, her eyes hollow with a wisdom too heavy for her tender years. Crowned against her will, she's remembered as the 9 Days Queen, a monarch so brief that her reign feels like a cruel joke whispered by fate. You watch her lift a trembling hand to her crown, not with pride, but with dread. She never wanted it, and yet the machinations of power thrust it upon her head. Behind her hover her sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey. Catherine, beautiful and impulsive, would later marry for love and pay with her freedom. Mary, tiny and deformed, would live in the shadows, mocked by courtiers but carrying the same cursed thread of Tudor blood. Together the Grey sisters represent ambition twisted by circumstance, their stories as fragile as parchment left in the rain. Why are they here? Because their grandmother was Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. That single thread tied them to the throne, and in the ruthless game of succession that thread became a noose. With Edward VI dying childless, power-hungry nobles pushed Jane forward as a Protestant alternative to Catholic Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's eldest daughter. Jane, pious and studious, became a pawn in a game she could never win. Historians still argue whether Jane was a tragic victim or a symbol of Protestant resistance. What's certain is that she was only 16 when she mounted the throne, and only 17 when she laid her head on the block at the tower. You close your eyes for a moment and hear the echo of the axe, the silence that follows. It is the sound of innocence sacrificed to ambition. Here's a quirky tidbit that lingers like a chill. Jane was so learned in languages that she could read Plato in Greek before most noblemen could even stumble through Latin. She wrote letters in flawless Italian and debated theology with bishops. Imagine a teenage girl in Tudor England, wielding intellect sharper than the swords that guarded her. Yet that brilliance could not save her from the trap of bloodline politics. In her you glimpse the same tragic irony that would later cling to Diana, extraordinary gifts, wasted by institutions that never knew how to value them. Now, step deeper into the Grey sisters' world. Catherine Grey's story twists differently. She falls in love with Edward Seymour, a match of passion rather than politics. They marry secretly, without royal permission, and when discovered, Elizabeth I is furious. Catherine is imprisoned in the Tower, her children declared illegitimate, her love punished as treasonous. She wastes away in captivity, her beauty fading behind stone walls. Can you feel the echo? Diana, centuries later, finds her love life scrutinised, condemned and manipulated by forces beyond her control. Different century, same iron grip. And then Mary Grey, the youngest. Curiously, she manages to outlive her sisters, despite her small stature and physical deformity. She marries a commoner for love, scandalising the court, but somehow escapes the Tower's harshest punishments. In her, you sense the stubborn survival instinct of the Tudor branches that slipped sideways, fragile yet unbroken, overlooked yet enduring. That endurance is what allowed Diana's bloodline to persist through centuries of turbulence. The chamber seems to darken as you realise the cruel symmetry. Elizabeth I, childless, kept her throne but extinguished her line. The Grey sisters, fertile and eager, found their children branded illegitimate or denied entirely. In both cases, dynastic obsession crushed human lives. Diana, 5 centuries later, would live out this paradox anew, bearing heirs who secured the Windsor dynasty, yet being crushed by the same system that demanded them. You wander to a window slit overlooking the Tower Green. The grass glows faint in moonlight, hiding centuries of blood spilled. Jane Grey walked here, her steps heavy with resignation, her prayers whispered into the damp air. She was only 17, closer in age to a modern teenager studying exams than to a hardened monarch, and yet history remembers her as queen, however briefly. You can almost see her spectral figure kneeling, her small frame swallowed by the executioner's block, her final words trembling in the chill. Historians still argue whether Jane should even be called queen. Some label her an usurper, a puppet thrust forward by scheming nobles. Others call her a martyr of faith, a Protestant saint. But for you, standing here centuries later, she is something else entirely. A reminder that royal blood, far from a blessing, can be a curse. Diana, adored as the people's princess, knew this curse too. The adoration that comes chained to scrutiny. The crown that glitters while cutting deep into flesh. Here's another eerie echo. Jane Grey's father, the Duke of Suffolk, tried to rebel after her fall, hoping to restore his family's fortunes. He failed, and his head joined hers on the block. In Tudor England, ambition rarely ended with triumph. More often it ended with sawdust and silence. You picture the Grey family crest gathering dust in forgotten corners of history, its motto mocked by fate. Yet their bloodline did not vanish. Through sidelong marriages, their descendants trickled into noble families, eventually intertwining with the Spencers. The gamble that destroyed them also ensured their legacy, and through that legacy Diana carries their shadows. Step back and notice the pattern. The Tudor dynasty is already unravelling, its direct line fragile, its collateral branches burned by ambition. In this unravelling, the Grey sisters shine like tragic lanterns, illuminating how dynastic obsession devours its own. Their gamble for power failed, but the consequences ripple forward. Their children, their marriages, their disgrace, all push the bloodline into crooked paths that will centuries later converge in Diana. You walk back through the chamber, candle sputtering. The air feels heavier now, weighed down by the innocence lost on Tower Green. Jane Grey's soft voice lingers in your ears, reciting her final prayer. Catherine's tears stain the cold stones of the tower. Mary's fragile figure vanishes into the quiet, and somewhere, faint but insistent, Diana's presence hovers, her story echoing theirs. She too was thrust into a crown she did not fully choose. She too was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic need. As you step into the corridor once more, the shadows gather. Ahead, you hear the faint sound of weeping and the distant echo of swords clashing. Another queen waits in the darkness, Mary, Queen of Scots. Her story, bound by ambition and betrayal, will send shockwaves that reach even further into Diana's bloodline, and the Tudor legacy, sinister and unrelenting, continues to tighten its grip. The torchlight flickers lower now, throwing long fingers of shadow down the corridor. You hear the faint clang of iron gates, and the rustle of silks brushing against stone. When you step into the chamber beyond, the air changes, thicker, charged, scented with the perfume of tragedy. Before you stands the tall, commanding figure of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a woman whose life was a storm of ambition, betrayal, and downfall. Her shadow stretches across centuries, and whether she intended it or not, it falls squarely over Diana's own bloodline. Mary enters like a vision, 6 feet tall, radiant, with auburn hair catching candlelight like flame. She was crowned Queen of Scotland while still an infant, betrothed to a French prince before she could walk, and widowed before her 20th birthday. She returns to Scotland a foreigner in her own land, carrying the grace of the French court but trapped in the snare of Scottish intrigue. You can almost hear the muttering of Scottish nobles torn between loyalty, jealousy, and outright rebellion. And why does her story matter for Diana? Because Mary's bloodline becomes the rope that ties the Tudor dynasty to the Stuarts, and from there to the Hanoverians, and eventually to the Windsors. When Elizabeth I dies childless, it is Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, who inherits the English throne. In other words, the fate of England after the Tudors rests on the shoulders of the woman now gliding before you like a restless ghost. Historians still argue whether Mary was naive or cunning, whether she was undone by her own flaws or by relentless circumstance. What's certain is that her life spirals with scandal that rivals even the most vicious tabloid front pages Diana ever endured. Married 3 times, accused of complicity in her second husband's murder, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, Mary's reign is a study in catastrophe. Yet through it all, her blood carries forward, threading into the royal lineage that Diana herself would later marry into. Here's a quirky tidbit. When Mary fled to England seeking Elizabeth's protection, she brought with her a collection of lavish gowns and jewellery that made even the English courtiers gape. Among them was a gown embroidered with scenes from Aesop's fables, foxes, crows, and grapes stitched in gold thread. Imagine the irony. A queen fleeing for her life still insists on travelling with couture that whispers moral lessons in silk. Diana, too, understood the language of clothing, how a dress could speak louder than words, how style could be weapon or shield. But Mary's gamble for Elizabeth's protection turns fatal. Elizabeth, wary of her cousin's claim to the throne, imprisons her for 19 years. You picture the years stretching like endless corridors of stone, Mary pacing her chambers, scribbling letters in cipher, embroidering while spies lurk just outside her door. Each day brings rumours of plots, some real, some fabricated. Elizabeth sees in Mary not just a cousin but a threat, the embodiment of every Catholic conspiracy that could topple her fragile throne. And then comes the execution. The year is 1587. The hall at Fotheringhay Castle is filled with hushed witnesses. Mary enters dressed in scarlet, the colour of martyrdom. Her voice is steady as she declares her Catholic faith and her innocence. You hold your breath as she kneels, her head laid on the block. The executioner swings, misses, swings again. Her lips are said to move in silent prayer even after the axe has fallen. The crowd gasps, the shadow lengthens, and England's history bends under the weight of her death. The echo of that axe never truly fades. Elizabeth, though victorious, is haunted. Nobles whisper that killing a queen sets a dangerous precedent. Centuries later, Diana's death will stir the same unease. What does it mean when a woman adored by the people perishes under the weight of a crown she could not bear? Different time, different weapon, same shiver through the spine of a nation. The shadow of Mary lingers especially strongly in the Stuart inheritance. Her son, James VI of Scotland, becomes James I of England after Elizabeth's death, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England for the first time. That single shift transforms the monarchy and charts the course for centuries of royal marriages and rivalries. Without Mary, Diana's ancestry would look entirely different. Without Mary's shadow, there might not even have been a monarchy for Diana to step into centuries later. Step closer to the wall and run your fingers across the stone. Somewhere beneath the surface lies the ciphered letters Mary wrote to her allies, plots woven in secret, desperate threads of escape. Historians still debate how deeply she was involved in conspiracies like the Babington Plot, which sealed her fate. Was she a scheming conspirator, or merely a pawn manipulated by those around her? The uncertainty mirrors the speculation Diana faced. Was she master of her own image, or was she crushed by forces beyond her control? The answer is tangled, both then and now. Another echo whispers through the centuries. Both Mary and Diana were women whose beauty became both blessing and curse. Both married young, both saw their marriages crumble, both found themselves imprisoned by institutions larger than themselves, one by castles and chains, the other by palaces and paparazzi. And both became martyrs of a kind, their deaths sanctified by public grief, their lives transformed into legend. Here's another curious detail. When Mary was executed, her little dog, hidden in the folds of her gown, leapt out and refused to leave her body. The faithful creature licked at her blood until it was dragged away, grieving in silence. You wince at the image, but you also recognise the eerie echo. When Diana died in Paris, it was her sons, William and Harry, who became the faithful mourners, clinging to her legacy as the world looked on. The shadow Mary casts is not just one of tragedy but of inheritance. Through her the Stuarts rise, leading eventually to the Hanoverians, the Georges, and finally to the House of Windsor. Through her, Diana's sons carry blood that is both Tudor and Stuart, both English and Scottish, both cursed and crowned. It is a legacy of fire and fragility, one that Diana never asked for but could never escape. You leave the chamber heavy-hearted, the echo of the axe still ringing faintly in your ears. Behind you, Mary fades into shadow, her tall figure dissolving into candle smoke. Ahead, the corridor darkens, and you sense the presence of other secrets. Whispers of bastards, of hidden affairs, of illegitimate lines that twist Diana's ancestry into even stranger shapes. The Tudors, after all, were never content with the official record. Their real history often lurked in the shadows, in whispered names and silenced scandals. Your candle sputters, and the air grows colder. You know the next step will take you deeper into those shadows, where the ghosts are less regal and more dangerous, their secrets shaping a legacy that reaches Diana in ways no chronicler dared write openly. The air thickens as you move deeper down the corridor, and this time the walls seem to lean in closer, as though they are trying to listen to your footsteps. Ahead lies not the grand throne rooms of kings and queens, but the hidden chambers, the backstairs whispers, the shadows where servants exchange secrets and courtiers slip in and out of chambers at midnight. Here, the Tudor story twists into its murkiest veins, those of illegitimate children, hidden liaisons, and scandalous rumours that quietly redirected history. And as you step forward, you realise these secrets don't stay buried. They ripple through time, knotting themselves into Diana's lineage centuries later. You probably wouldn't last a day in this world. Every glance is a test, every murmur could end your life, and every hidden pregnancy might shape the future of a dynasty. The Tudors perfected the art of spectacle in public, but their true power plays often unfolded behind heavy drapes, in perfumed chambers, and through the whispered laughter of mistresses. Consider Henry VIII, who looms in this hall like an ever-present storm. While his 6 official wives are remembered in rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, there were countless women who shared his bed without ever sharing his crown. From these liaisons, rumours of illegitimate children sprouted like weeds. One name burns brighter than others, Henry Fitzroy. Born of Henry VIII's mistress, Elizabeth Blount, Fitzroy was openly acknowledged by the king. In fact, Henry showered him with titles, making him Duke of Richmond, almost grooming him as a potential heir. Imagine that. The entire course of English history might have pivoted on the survival of a bastard child. Historians still argue whether Henry ever intended Fitzroy to inherit the throne, or whether the boy's elevation was simply a way to flaunt royal virility. Fitzroy died young, at only 17, of what was likely tuberculosis. But you sense how fragile the Tudor line truly was, when even a king considered a bastard as potential saviour of the dynasty. Diana's own life carried the faint echo of this fragility. The monarchy, always desperate for heirs, often reduced women to vessels and children to pawns, legitimate or not. Here's a quirky tidbit. Elizabeth Blount, Fitzroy's mother, was so celebrated for her beauty that courtiers joked her name suited her. She was the blauntest blossom in Henry's garden. But beauty was dangerous currency. Too much favour from the king, and you risked the queen's fury. Too little, and you faded into obscurity. Blount slipped quietly into later life, married off to a respectable husband, her brief moment at the centre of dynastic possibility erased. Yet her son's ghost hovered, reminding England of how thin the Tudor thread could be. And Henry VIII wasn't the only monarch tangled in whispers. Elizabeth I, his daughter, lived as the Virgin Queen, but rumours persisted that she too bore secret children. Her close relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, fuelled endless speculation. Did they marry in secret? Did they produce heirs tucked away in the countryside, their identities scrubbed from records? No proof survives, but the whispers cling stubbornly to history. If true, those phantom children might have carried Tudor blood quietly into lines no historian can fully trace. Imagine the irony, an age obsessed with lineage, yet some of its most significant legacies might lie hidden in plain sight. And then there were the Howards, the Seymours, the Boleyns, all families deeply entwined with both legitimate and illegitimate branches of royal blood. Anne Boleyn herself was accused of promiscuity, with gossip swirling about lovers and even her own brother, though likely fabricated to justify her downfall. Yet the damage was done. Reputation in Tudor England was as sharp a weapon as any sword. A rumour could cut deeper than steel, and those rumours often redirected marriage alliances, inheritance claims, and dynastic futures. You pause and imagine the royal court not as a clean family tree but as a knotted bramble bush. Bastards, half-siblings, cousins twice removed, all jostled for recognition. Some were buried in silence, others flaunted as proof of virility. And centuries later, when genealogists traced Diana's ancestry, they found not a neat line of descent but a tangle of names, some glowing with honour, others whispered like secrets best forgotten. Historians still argue whether Diana's lineage directly carries the blood of Fitzroy or other illegitimate Tudors. The evidence is thin, but the possibility lingers, like candle smoke that never quite clears. What is certain is that her family, the Spencers, intermarried with noble houses that hovered around the Tudors, houses that could easily have carried those hidden threads. Diana's life itself became a reminder of how little the monarchy could escape its own messy past. Here's a detail that almost makes you laugh in the gloom. Henry VIII's court was so riddled with affairs that foreign ambassadors complained they couldn't keep track of who was sleeping with whom. One ambassador from Spain wrote home that the English court was as full of lust as it is of ambition. Imagine being tasked with diplomacy while your king's latest mistress distracted half the nobility. It's almost sitcom-worthy, except the stakes were life and death. You turn a corner and find yourself in a smaller, darker chamber, the kind where a lady-in-waiting might have hidden her shame, where whispers of a swelling belly could mean either fortune or ruin. These spaces, unseen in grand portraits, shaped history more than councils and battles. A bastard child could topple reputations, spark rebellion, or quietly shift inheritance centuries later. Diana's ancestry is built on these silences as much as on coronations. Think of the irony. While Tudor England obsessed over pure lineage, it was often the illegitimate branches that carried the blood forward in surprising directions. The official line might glitter in the spotlight, but the hidden veins pulsed just as strongly, shaping the future. Diana herself, officially an aristocrat marrying into the Windsors, embodied this paradox. She was both perfect choice and dangerous outsider, beloved by the people, yet unsettling to the institution. The Tudors would have understood that tension perfectly. You linger on one last image before leaving the chamber, a cradle, empty, rocking faintly as if touched by unseen hands. Was the child inside legitimate or illegitimate? Did it matter? For in the end, the blood still flowed, the lineage still stretched, and centuries later, a princess named Diana bore its weight. The shadows gather again, pulling you forward. The corridor bends toward another family, ambitious, ruthless, forever circling the throne like wolves. The Howards wait ahead, their ambition so sharp it cut down their own daughters, their name forever tangled with both glory and disgrace. And Diana, unknowingly, carries their story too. The corridor widens, its ceiling vaulted high like the ribs of some great beast. Here the air is colder, and on the walls hang coats of arms, lions, fleur-de-lis, and above all the proud crest of the Howard family. You stop, because the Howards are not just another noble house. They're a dynasty within the dynasty, a clan so ambitious and cunning that their fingerprints are all over Tudor history. And whether she realised it or not, Diana carried traces of their story in her own veins. You probably wouldn't want to sit through a Howard family dinner. Imagine the conversations. Who's being married off to whom? Who's climbing closer to the throne? Who's about to be arrested for treason? Every course of roasted swan or sugared almond would come laced with plots. The Howards thrived in the Tudor court, but always by dancing on the knife's edge between glory and destruction. The family's patriarch in the early Tudor years, Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, fought at the Battle of Bosworth on Richard III's side, and lived to switch allegiance when Henry VII triumphed. His family quickly found their way back into royal favour. By the time Henry VIII roared onto the throne, the Howards were firmly in the game, marrying their daughters and nieces into positions of immense influence. The most famous Howard woman, Anne Boleyn, needs no introduction. She was Henry VIII's second queen, whose sharp wit and ambition lifted her from lady-in-waiting to crowned consort, and whose head rolled in the Tower only 3 years later. But Anne was not alone. Another Howard, Catherine Howard, became Henry's 5th wife, a teenager swept into a marriage with the bloated, ageing king. She too ended on the scaffold, accused of adultery. 2 Howard women queens, 2 Howard women executed. If the family crest had room for a motto, it might as well read, "Fortune favours until it doesn't." Historians still argue whether the Howards themselves engineered their daughters' ascents, or whether the tide of courtly ambition simply carried them along. But what's certain is that the clan cultivated a reputation for ruthless survival. They switched loyalties when needed, smiled when threatened, and always found a way to cling to influence. The cost was often their daughters' lives, but in the cold calculations of Tudor politics, such sacrifices were not unusual. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Howard women were famed not just for their ambition, but for their striking appearance. Anne Boleyn was said to have a long, elegant neck, tragically noted when it met the blade. Catherine Howard, by contrast, was remembered for her youthful charm and flirtatious spirit. Imagine being known in history not for your thoughts, but for the length of your neck or the tilt of your smile. Yet that is how dynasties often judged women, as ornaments, not individuals. Diana, centuries later, endured the same reduction. Praised for her beauty, her fashion, her charisma, while her pain was often dismissed. The Howards didn't vanish with the fall of Anne and Catherine. Far from it. They remained powerful, manoeuvring in court politics, aligning with whichever side promised survival. Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, managed to survive both Henry VIII's reign and the volatile years that followed, though not without stretches in the Tower. His cunning was legendary. He knew when to flatter, when to kneel, and when to bide his time. You can almost picture him smirking in the shadows, whispering, "Outlast the storm and the crown will need you again." And outlast they did. The Howards resurfaced in Elizabeth I's reign, with figures like Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, who plotted marriage with Mary, Queen of Scots. That gamble ended with his execution, another Howard head rolling. Yet even then the family endured. Their bloodline trickled into countless noble houses, their marriages spreading like ivy across the aristocracy. Eventually, those tendrils wound their way into Diana's heritage. Historians still argue whether the Howard legacy should be remembered as villainous or simply pragmatic. Were they traitors, constantly flirting with treason, or survivors, doing what any family would do to stay afloat in a shark tank like the Tudor court? Perhaps both. Either way, they embody the ruthless streak that haunted Diana's world, an understanding that survival in royalty means compromise, calculation, and sacrifice. Here's another curious echo. When Catherine Howard was arrested, it is said she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it. Picture that. A teenage girl rehearsing her own death like a macabre stage performance. Diana, centuries later, rehearsed too, not for death, but for survival in a palace that often felt like a stage, where every smile was performance and every misstep was punished. Different rehearsals, same dread. The Howard name carried both menace and allure. Poets of the Tudor court, like Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, gave English poetry some of its earliest sonnets. Their legacy was not just political, but cultural. Yet even this beauty came with blood. The Earl of Surrey was executed in 1547, his artistry not enough to save him. The Howards seemed cursed to brilliance and destruction in equal measure, and Diana, descended through noble lines entwined with theirs, bore that same curse, brilliant in presence, doomed in destiny. Walk down the long gallery lined with Howard portraits. You see stern faces, elaborate gowns, eyes that seem to follow you. They gaze with a mix of pride and warning, as if to say, "Ambition made us, ambition destroyed us. Will you too carry that burden?" Diana's life answers yes. Her rise into global adoration was meteoric, her fall devastating. The Howards would have recognised the pattern instantly. Historians still argue whether Diana herself ever understood the depth of her ancestral ties. Perhaps she never traced the Howards in her tree, but the resonance is undeniable. She too was swept into a court that devoured its women, that smiled in public while scheming in private. She too learned that crowns, whether literal or symbolic, are edged with knives. One last detail before you leave this gallery: the Howard family motto, Sola Virtus Invicta. Only virtue is unconquered, a noble sentiment, but painfully ironic for a family that lost so many members to scandal, treason, and execution. You whisper it aloud, and it echoes strangely, as if mocking itself. Perhaps Diana, remembered by millions for her compassion and virtue, was the only Howard-descended figure to live up to it. Yet even she was not unconquered by fate. The portraits fade as your candle gutters low. Ahead, the corridor darkens once more. A familiar figure waits in the gloom, a woman with dark eyes and a proud bearing, whose rise and fall became the most infamous scandal of them all. Anne Boleyn is calling, and her story is next. The corridor narrows, and you sense the air sharpening, charged with something like static. Ahead, the flicker of your candle throws the silhouette of a woman against the wall. Slender, regal, eyes glinting with both fire and fear. Anne Boleyn steps from the shadows, and you know immediately that hers is not a tale you can pass by quickly. She is the queen whose ambition altered the course of a nation, whose fall thundered across Europe, and whose bloodlines snake their way, in crooked silence, into the nobility that would one day produce Diana. Anne enters like a vision from a court masque. Raven dark hair, French-influenced fashion shimmering with jewels, and a manner so arresting that courtiers whispered she was more enchantress than queen. She was never meant to be Henry VIII's consort. She began as a lady-in-waiting, charming, clever, and far too confident for a world that demanded female obedience. But Henry, bored with his aging wife Catherine of Aragon, saw in Anne not just desire but possibility. With Anne, he imagined sons. With Anne, he imagined escape from Rome. With Anne, he imagined power unchained. Historians still argue whether Anne truly loved Henry, or whether she played the game to lift her family's fortune. What's certain is that she refused to be his mistress. Unlike so many others, she would not yield her body without a crown. And in that defiance, she unwittingly set England on a course toward the Reformation. You probably wouldn't have survived in her place. The sheer nerve of holding a king at arm's length could have cost her head before it even wore a crown, but for a time, her gamble worked. Here's a curious tidbit. Anne introduced Henry to the works of William Tyndale, whose English translations of the Bible were banned at the time. Imagine that. A queen, slipping her husband books that would inspire him to defy the Pope and create a new church. It's almost like passing secret mixtapes across a classroom, except instead of teenage romance, you're toppling centuries of Catholic supremacy. Diana, centuries later, would echo this pattern in her own quiet way, introducing the monarchy to compassion, openness, and vulnerability that it never asked for but could never shake once revealed. Yet Anne's crown glittered with thorns. She bore Henry one living child, Elizabeth, but never the son he craved. Miscarriages and stillbirths piled up, each one a nail hammered into her coffin. And Henry, as always, grew restless. The court began to whisper. Was Anne a witch? Had she seduced the king with sorcery? Were her deformities, the supposed sixth finger, the small mole on her neck, signs of the devil? Most of these claims were lies fabricated to justify her downfall, but you can feel how quickly admiration turned to suspicion. In Tudor England, the higher you rose, the swifter the axe awaited. You walk with her into the Tower of London, her final prison. The cobblestones echo beneath her steps, the same stones that will soon drink her blood. She kneels, elegant even in defeat, and speaks her final words with a composure that chills you. She proclaims her innocence, prays for the king, and accepts her fate. The French executioner, brought specially for his skill, raises his sword. With a single stroke, her head falls, her body forever remembered as the price of ambition. You shiver because the silence after is heavier than any scream. Historians still argue whether Anne was guilty of the charges, adultery, incest, treason, or whether she was framed by her enemies and her husband's desperation. The consensus leans toward fabrication, but the tragedy remains. She was not the first woman destroyed by the machinery of monarchy, and she would not be the last. Diana too was accused, slandered, whispered about in tabloids that played the same role as Tudor rumour-mongers. Both women became scapegoats for a king, or a crown, that could not bear its own failures. Here's a quirky echo. Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, grew up carrying the stain of her mother's downfall. Many doubted her legitimacy, sneering that she was the bastard daughter of the concubine. Yet Elizabeth rose to become one of England's greatest monarchs, proving that bloodlines, however tainted by scandal, could still yield greatness. Diana too carried shadows in her blood but transformed them into light for her sons. Out of disgrace, resilience bloomed. The legacy of Anne Boleyn flows not just through Elizabeth but through the countless noble families connected to her kin. The Boleyns, through marriages, link themselves to the Howards and beyond. Over centuries their branches spread into the aristocracy, tangled with families like the Spencers. By the time Diana was born, she carried in her veins the faint, dangerous shimmer of Anne's legacy. Beauty that unsettles, charisma that captivates, and a fate stalked by tragedy. Pause for a moment and imagine a Tudor court masque. Torches flare, masks glitter, and dancers spin in elaborate steps. Behind the laughter and music, alliances shift and daggers gleam. Anne Boleyn once danced here, dazzling the king while her enemies plotted her ruin. Diana, in her own time, walked similar stages. Charity galas, royal tours, endless public appearances, smiling while gossip columns sharpened their pens. Both knew the performance could never end, not until fate brought down the curtain. Historians still debate whether Anne's true legacy was religious, political, or personal. Did she ignite the English Reformation by accident or design? Was she a feminist before her time, or simply another victim of patriarchal ambition? Perhaps she was all of these at once. And Diana too resists simple categories: princess, martyr, rebel, saint. Both women live on not just as individuals but as symbols, refracted through the gaze of those who loved them and those who destroyed them. Here's one last eerie detail. When Anne's body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the tower, no monument marked her resting place for centuries. Only later was a memorial laid for her. For a long time she was deliberately forgotten, erased, silenced. Diana too was buried away from the public, on an island at Althorpe, her family estate. In both cases, women who defined their age were tucked quietly away in death, as if the monarchy hoped their ghosts might not linger. But ghosts, as you've seen tonight, linger stubbornly. As you leave the tower's shadow, you carry Anne's presence with you. The danger, the allure, the charisma, the curse. It all flows forward into Diana's story. The Tudor legacy is not just in names and genealogies. It is in the patterns that repeat. Women raised high only to be cut down, adored by the people, but destroyed by the crown. You hear Anne's whisper in the darkness, a warning that echoes into the late 20th century. Beauty and power may win hearts, but in this dynasty, they rarely save lives. The corridor stretches on, colder now. Ahead you hear faint mutterings, not of kings or queens this time, but of curses, omens and superstitions that haunted the Tudor bloodline. Diana's story will tangle with these too, because even in the rational modern age, shadows of prophecy and fate cling tightly to royal veins. You brace yourself, for the next chamber will not be about flesh and blood, but about whispers of curses that refuse to die. The corridor turns again, narrowing until you feel as if you're slipping into a secret passage carved behind the walls of history. The stone is damp here, slick beneath your fingertips, and the air hums with something intangible. Fear, rumour, perhaps even superstition. You're no longer in the bright throne rooms of monarchs, but in the invisible spaces where servants whisper, priests mutter over charms, and queens clutch amulets under their gowns. For while the Tudors projected splendour and command, they were haunted, always, by the shadows of curses and omens, and those whispers, whether true or imagined, still coil like ivy around Diana's bloodline centuries later. You might laugh at first. After all, weren't the Tudors the architects of a modern England, breaking with Rome, creating laws, founding dynastic institutions? But step closer. Scratch the gilt surface and you'll find a dynasty deeply afraid of fate, forever peering at the stars, forever fearing that curses trailed their every move. You probably wouldn't survive this world, because if you slipped in a joke about horoscopes, someone might drag you to the stake for witchcraft. And yet, the highest in the land placed their trust in charms and portents. Think of Henry VIII, whose life was ruled by omens. When his infant son Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died after just 52 days, some claimed it was punishment from God for marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Others whispered that Catherine herself had cursed the king for casting her aside. His misfortunes in securing heirs were read less as bad luck and more as divine judgment. Every miscarriage Anne Boleyn suffered, every stillbirth Jane Seymour endured, fed the superstition that the Tudors were living under a shadow of doom. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Tudors were obsessed with astrology. Before major decisions, coronations, weddings, even military campaigns, astrologers were summoned to cast charts. Elizabeth I herself kept Dr. John Dee, a mathematician and mystic, as her advisor. Imagine it, the fate of a nation's armies hinging on the interpretation of Saturn's position. Dee even claimed to speak with angels through a crystal ball. Courtiers snickered behind his back, but none dared dismiss him, because Elizabeth trusted his counsel. Diana, centuries later, sought comfort in astrologers too, confiding in seers who told her her life would be short. The echo is almost too eerie to ignore. Historians still argue whether these Tudor obsessions were mere theatre, tools to reassure the public, or genuine fears that guided their choices. What's certain is that superstition thrived in the court's corridors, and when tragedies unfolded, people reached for supernatural explanations faster than rational ones. Consider the ghost stories of the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn's headless spectre was said to drift along its halls. The young princes murdered in the Tower decades earlier were whispered to cry out in the night. Even Henry VIII himself, bloated and furious, was rumoured to haunt Hampton Court. In these tales, curses were not abstract. They walked, they wailed, they pressed icy hands against the living. Diana's own life became a kind of haunting too. Photographed endlessly, gossiped about relentlessly, her presence lingering even after death, her face appearing on murals, candles and vigils around the world. One curse in particular clings with stubborn persistence, the so-called Boleyn curse. It was said that those who destroyed Anne or her kin would suffer ruin themselves, and indeed many of her enemies met grisly ends. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her fall, was later executed. Henry VIII himself died diseased and tormented. Whether coincidence or curse, the story stuck. Centuries later, Diana's supporters whispered something similar, that the institution that broke her would one day reap its own downfall. You sense that both Anne and Diana became larger than life, their deaths woven into myth as warnings. Here's another strange echo. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was believed by some to carry the weight of a curse when she mounted the throne. Her reign was so brief, her death so swift that it seemed almost fated. The people whispered that any woman who sought England's crown was doomed. Elizabeth I, aware of this whisper, styled herself not as a wife or mother but as a virgin goddess, untouchable by the curse of childbirth or betrayal. Diana, centuries later, would also feel the burden of being a royal woman under intense expectation, knowing that adoration could turn into devouring. You pause in this dim chamber, and your candlelight falls across a tapestry woven with strange symbols: stars, comets, dragons. Comets especially terrified the Tudors. In 1556, a great comet blazed across the sky, and the people of Europe trembled. Preachers declared it a harbinger of doom. Elizabeth I herself reportedly wept, fearing it foretold her death. Compare this to the comet that streaked across the skies in 1997, just weeks before Diana's fatal crash. The world gasped then too, tying celestial fire to earthly tragedy. Superstition may change its language, but its pull remains the same. Historians still argue whether curses shaped policy or merely mirrored fear, yet one cannot deny how persistently these whispers clung to the dynasty. From sweating sickness to failed heirs, from shipwrecks to rebellions, each Tudor misfortune was read as a sign that some invisible hand, God, fate, or a curse, was punishing them. There's a curious tidbit that makes you smile despite the gloom. Elizabeth I owned a ring with a secret locket inside, containing a portrait of herself and her mother, Anne Boleyn. She kept it hidden until her death. Imagine the symbolism. A queen who lived under the shadow of her mother's execution still clutching her image against her skin, as if warding off a curse with memory. Diana too wore jewellery with private meanings, talismans of defiance and hope hidden in plain sight. But the darker side of Tudor superstition lay in scapegoats. When crops failed or heirs died, someone had to be blamed. Women were accused of witchcraft, servants whispered about poisoning, foreigners became convenient villains. The court lived in fear not just of the supernatural but of being named its cause. Diana lived this echo as well. When her marriage crumbled and her life grew chaotic, the press sought to cast blame. Was she too fragile, too reckless, too outspoken? In every century, power protects itself by pointing fingers elsewhere. You step back now, the tapestry's dragons curling into shadow. The room feels colder, as if the very stones remember the muttered spells, the fearful prayers, the desperate clinging to charms. The Tudors may have thought themselves masters of fate, but fate, it seems, always had the last laugh. Diana's story, too, would be wrapped in whispers of premonitions and prophecies, her tragic end framed not just as accident, but as inevitability. As you leave this chamber, you hear faint echoes of the tower's ghosts, the rustle of Elizabeth clutching her hidden locket, the cry of Anne's curse. Ahead lies another hall, brighter at first but filled with sharper edges, the wars of succession that tore the dynasty apart after Elizabeth's death. The curses may have been whispers, but the succession crises were thunder. And you must step into that storm next. The torches rattle in their sconces as you push open the next heavy door, and the sound that greets you is no longer whispers of curses, but the clash of boots and the scrape of steel. The Tudor story has reached its brittle edge. Elizabeth I sits upon her throne childless, and when the Virgin Queen finally exhales her last breath in 1603, the silence is deafening. For the first time in more than a century, England has no clear Tudor heir, and what follows is less a smooth handover of power and more a dangerous scramble. A war of succession fought not always on battlefields, but in treaties, in plots, in whispered claims of blood. You stand in a chamber where advisors crowd around a map, their fingers stabbing at family trees instead of fortresses. The Tudors had burned so brightly, but like a candle, they sputter out suddenly, leaving smoke and confusion. Elizabeth's death without issue means the line must reach sideways, searching for legitimacy in cousins and distant branches. And here is where Diana's bloodline lurks in the margins, those crooked branches of nobility suddenly thrust into the centre of dynastic storms. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth should have named a clear successor earlier. She resisted to the end, reluctant to admit mortality, wary of empowering a rival while she still lived. But when the throne fell empty, the strongest claim came through Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James VI of Scotland. His mother's execution had made him an uneasy figure, but his Tudor blood, descended through Henry VII's eldest daughter, Margaret Tudor, could not be denied. So the crown leapt across the border, and James became James I of England. The so-called Union of the Crowns in 1603 marked the birth of a new age, but it was born of Tudor fragility. You can almost hear the grumbling of English courtiers, suspicious of a Scottish king, uneasy about what new turbulence this would bring. In taverns and villages, people muttered about whether God truly blessed the Stuart claim, or whether the Tudors' childlessness was a curse upon the nation. Even in triumph, the monarchy quivered with doubt. Here's a curious tidbit. James arrived in London with a massive entourage of Scots, so many that Londoners complained the city smelled of foreign stables. He had to bribe English nobles with titles and lands just to calm resentment. Imagine the awkwardness. Your new king showing up with all his buddies and expecting you to clap. It feels almost sitcom-like, except the stakes are crowns and wars. Yet James's accession did not erase rival claims. Descendants of the Grey Sisters, those tragic pawns executed or imprisoned in earlier reigns, still had blood ties to the Tudors. Supporters whispered their names, wondering if England might prefer a native heir over a Scottish import. The wars of succession were not fought with pitched battles like the Wars of the Roses, but they simmered in conspiracies, gunpowder plots, and endless paranoia. The monarchy survived, but just barely. And in those shaky survival tactics, Diana's future family lines wound tighter into the mix, every noble family now tied more closely to the crown than ever before. You might think the age of swords and rebellions was over by then, but step further into the corridor and you'll hear the hiss of gunpowder. In 1605, the gunpowder plot nearly blew James I and Parliament sky high. Catholics, furious at persecution, plotted to annihilate the government in one fiery stroke. Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators were caught just in time, but the echo of that explosion that never was lingers even now in England's bonfire night. And it all traces back to succession tension, the lingering feeling that a Scottish king with Tudor blood wasn't truly secure. Diana's ancestry drifts through this storm like smoke. Her family, the Spencers, would later rise as loyal courtiers under Stuart and Hanoverian kings, cementing their role in royal circles. But their position was only possible because the Tudor succession crisis forced the crown to broaden its circle of trusted nobility. In a sense, Diana's story begins here, in the cracks left behind when the Tudors failed to produce heirs. Historians still argue whether the Tudor dynasty truly ended with Elizabeth, or whether its shadow continued through James and his descendants. After all, James was Tudor through Margaret's line, just not directly through Henry VIII. But what's undeniable is that the wars of succession left scars on the monarchy. Each branch tugged at the other, nobles whispered treason, and Europe's courts watched eagerly for collapse. Diana's fate centuries later, married into a monarchy always conscious of survival, was just another verse in this ancient song of precarious continuity. You pause at a window overlooking the English countryside. Imagine it in 1603. Villagers gathering, nervous, asking one another whether they should cheer for a Stuart king. Some prayed for stability, others feared another round of bloody conflict. In their uncertainty, you glimpse the DNA of modern Britain itself, a nation forever anxious about monarchy, forever balancing between reverence and rebellion. Diana's death in 1997 sparked the same ambivalence, the same questioning of what the crown truly meant, the same whispers of whether the monarchy could even survive. Here's another curious echo. Elizabeth II on her deathbed is said to have named James as her heir by pointing weakly at a courtier's ring engraved with his name. Whether true or not, the story dramatizes the uncertainty of the moment. Imagine a dying queen, speechless, signalling with a piece of jewellery who should rule next. Diana too left symbols rather than speeches. Her fashion choices, her compassion, her subtle acts of defiance, pointing at futures she herself would not live to see. The wars of succession did not produce pitched battles like Towton or Bosworth, but they left England restless. Catholics plotted in cellars, Protestants sharpened their suspicions, and nobles shifted allegiances like gamblers at a rigged table. James survived, and his dynasty would rule for a century before collapsing into civil war. But the instability born in 1603 never truly died. It became part of the monarchy's bloodstream, pulsing forward into every reign, into every scandal, into every desperate marriage that sought to secure the line. Diana stepped into that bloodstream in 1981, perhaps not realising how ancient its turbulence really was. As you step back from the map table, the voices of courtiers fade. The chamber darkens. But you know the story does not end here, for if the Tudors left a vacuum, it was the Stuarts who filled it, carrying their own shadows, their own ambitions, their own tragedies. And Diana's ancestry flows straight through them, carrying Tudor blood sideways into Stuart veins. The corridor ahead brightens slightly, as if dawn is breaking over the Scottish Highlands. You hear the faint skirl of bagpipes, the rustle of royal robes trimmed in ermine, the laughter of a king eager to unite two crowns. The Stuart inheritance waits for you, and with it the next layer of Diana's bloodline, an inheritance born not of certainty, but of fragile bargains and uneasy unions. The corridor opens at last into a great hall, its banners striped with both the English lions and the Scottish saltire. The air smells faintly of smoke from a hearth that has long since gone cold, yet you feel the shift in the walls themselves. The Tudors are gone, their line extinguished with Elizabeth's death. In their place steps a new dynasty, the Stuarts, and with them comes the uneasy weight of inheritance. Diana's bloodline trickles straight through this moment, flowing not from Henry VIII's children, but from the quiet side branch of Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's eldest daughter. It is through her that Tudor red mingled with Stuart tartan, and it is through her that Diana, centuries later, would inherit the long haunted legacy of both crowns. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England in 1603. He strides into London with a swagger, declaring himself king by divine right. The courtiers bow, the church bells ring, but beneath the jubilation there is unease. He is foreign-born, raised in the austere Scottish court, and though he claims descent from the Tudors, it is a cousin branch at best. You can almost hear the murmuring of nobles in the shadows. Is this truly our king? Historians still argue whether James's reign was a continuation of Tudor strength or the fragile beginning of something new. What is certain is that his inheritance changed everything. England and Scotland, bitter rivals for centuries, now share a crown. The Tudor line may be extinguished, but its blood flows on, redirected into Stuart veins. Diana's ancestry, drawn down through Margaret Tudor's line, anchors itself in this very moment. Here's a curious tidbit. James I fancied himself a scholar as much as a monarch. He wrote treatises on witchcraft and kingship, dabbling in theology as though he were a university don. His book Demonology helped fuel witch hunts across England and Scotland. Imagine it. Your king obsessing over demons while courtiers jostle for power. Diana's life, too, was lived under the double lens of scholarship and superstition. Psychics told her she would die young. Newspapers analysed her every move as if interpreting sacred texts. Both monarch and princess lived in a world where words could conjure monsters. The Stuart inheritance also brings turbulence. Religious divisions deepen, with Catholics disappointed in James's reluctance to ease persecution, and Protestants wary of his flirtations with tolerance. In 1605, the gunpowder plot nearly blows everything apart. You can smell the black powder in the cellar, see Guy Fawkes crouched with a lantern. The monarchy survives by a thread, but the event leaves scars. Every November, bonfires burn in England, a reminder of just how fragile that inheritance was. Diana's bloodline moves through this smoke, shaped by a monarchy that learned early how easily destruction could strike. You walk past tall windows and glimpse the Scottish Highlands in your imagination, mist curling over hills, clans bound by loyalty and feuds. Through Margaret Tudor, the Tudors became kin to these rugged lands. Diana, 5 centuries later, would return to Scotland often, finding solace in Balmoral, a place she both loved and hated. The Stuart inheritance made Scotland part of her story before she ever set foot there. The Stuart kings, after James, carry forward the same instability. Charles I, his son, inherits the throne and soon clashes with Parliament. His belief in divine right, inherited partly from Tudor absolutism, leads to civil war. You hear the tramp of soldiers' boots, the rattle of muskets, the thunder of cannon. By 1649, Charles is executed outside Whitehall, his head severed like so many Tudor queens before him. For the first time, England is a republic. Imagine the shock. A king, descendant of both Tudors and Stuarts, humbled before the axe. Diana's lineage passes through these tremors, carrying the reminder that crowns are never safe, no matter how gilded. Here's a quirky echo. Charles I was barely 5'4", so short that his subjects mocked his stature. Yet in portraits, painters stretched him taller, giving him dignity in oils, if not in life. Diana, tall and elegant, needed no such embellishment. Yet in photographs too, truth was often distorted. Smiles emphasised, sorrows cropped away. Both Charles and Diana lived lives refracted through the lens of image, their realities blurred by what others wanted to see. The Stuarts return with Charles II after the collapse of Cromwell's republic, and suddenly England swings from Puritan gloom to libertine splendour. Charles II's court is filled with mistresses, feasts, laughter and scandal. Illegitimate children are acknowledged, ennobled, given titles. The monarchy, once so obsessed with purity, revels in excess. You can almost hear the music, smell the wine, see the powdered wigs swaying as courtiers laugh too loudly. Diana's ancestry drifts through these halls too because her family, the Spencers, rose in influence during the Stuart Restoration. Their loyalty to the crown during upheaval earned them prestige that would eventually put Diana herself on a collision course with Windsor destiny. Historians still argue whether the Stuart inheritance was a blessing or a curse. It gave England union with Scotland, cultural richness, and resilience through war. But it also sowed seeds of division that would erupt for centuries. Religious fractures, questions of legitimacy, the balance between crown and parliament, all were sharpened in Stuart times, and Diana, stepping into the monarchy centuries later, walked on ground still cracked by those fault lines. Think of another curious tidbit. Charles II kept a pet spaniel at court, a breed that still bears his name, Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Imagine the absurdity of courtiers bowing while the king's dog sprawled across velvet cushions. And yet, that image of royal indulgence carried forward, shaping how monarchy was seen, both human and absurd. Diana's love of her own dogs, often photographed with her, carried a softer echo of that royal indulgence, a reminder that behind crowns and scandals small affections endure. You step into another chamber now, hung with portraits of Stuart queens, Henrietta Maria, French and Catholic, vilified by the English. Catherine of Braganza, mocked for her foreign ways but remembered for introducing tea to England. Queens who endured suspicion, gossip and loneliness. You see their faces pale under jewelled crowns, and you think of Diana again, alone in her palace rooms, accused by tabloids, adored by the people, and yet trapped in silence. The Stuart inheritance did not free women from Tudor patterns. It reinforced them. The hall grows quieter as your candle burns low. The banners above shift in a draught, the lions and crosses blending in flickering shadow. You sense how fragile inheritance truly is. Not a straight line of crowns, but a jagged path through blood, betrayal and survival. Diana's presence hovers still, her lineage marked by every step the Tudors and Stuarts took. The childless Tudors handed the crown sideways. The Stuarts picked it up, dropped it, fought over it, and clung to it through storms. And all of that turbulence flowed straight down into Diana's veins. The corridor ahead darkens once again, but you catch the faint clink of goblets and the rustle of silks. Another chapter waits, not of kings and queens at the centre, but of the noble houses around them, marrying for convenience, forging alliances and bargaining futures. The marriages that seem pragmatic at the time will, centuries later, shape Diana's destiny. You steady your breath, step forward, and let the shadows swallow you again. The corridor ahead opens into a smaller hall, and you notice at once that the air feels different here. Gone is the thunder of armies, the booming laughter of kings, the cries of condemned queens. Instead, the chamber hums with murmurs of negotiation, the scrape of quills over parchment, and the muted clinking of goblets as noble families sit across from one another, bargaining over dowries and titles. This is not the stage of kings, but the quiet theatre of aristocrats, where marriages became weapons and contracts bound tighter than any chain. And in this space of whispered vows and unsigned treaties, Diana's bloodline winds its way forward, shaped less by love than by convenience. You pause at a long oak table where figures lean in, their rings catching candlelight as they mark agreements. You realise that for centuries the marriages that carried Tudor and Stuart blood into noble lines were not born of passion, but of strategy. Every union was a chess move, every bride a pawn, every groom a gamble. You probably wouldn't last long in such a room. If you dared mention marrying for love, the nobles would laugh until their wine spilled. In this world, love was a luxury for poets, blood was currency. One of the most pivotal bargains lies in the marriage of Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's eldest daughter, to James the Weir of Scotland. That union, sealed after the bloody Battle of Flodden, stitched together Tudor red and Scottish tartan. But it was not a fairy tale. Margaret, widowed young, remarried against the wishes of her council, igniting scandal. Yet her lineage proved unshakable. Her grandson, James VI of Scotland, would become James I of England, uniting the crowns. Diana's ancestry flows directly through this line, a living testament to how a marriage forged for convenience reshaped an entire continent. Historians still argue whether Margaret's marriage was a masterstroke of diplomacy or a reckless gamble. But what's certain is that it set the precedent. Noble women carried dynastic weight like armoured shields. Their wombs turned into battlegrounds for alliances. Centuries later, Diana would walk into her own arranged marriage, her personal desires muted beneath the need to secure heirs. The echo is sharp. You sense Margaret's sighs and Diana's tears vibrating in the same frequency. Here's a curious tidbit. Many aristocratic marriage contracts in Tudor and Stuart England included clauses about not just dowries but behaviour. A bride might be forbidden from returning to her family estate, or a groom bound to specific loyalties. Imagine reading a prenup so detailed it dictates how often you must visit your in-laws. Yet to these families, such restrictions were worth it if they safeguarded inheritance. Diana's own prenuptial arrangements, shrouded in secrecy, carried the same flavour, her role clearly defined before she even wore the wedding gown. You walk further and see portraits of other unions, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, whose marriage ended the Wars of the Roses. Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, married first to the ageing King of France for diplomacy, then scandalously to Charles Brandon for love. That rare love match nearly cost both their lives, but Henry forgave his sister, eventually. Their descendants too trickled into Diana's tree. Each marriage, whether of strategy or scandal, added another thread to the tapestry of her ancestry. And then there were the smaller unions, often overlooked by chroniclers but just as important. The marriages of earls and dukes, binding the Howards to the Boleyns, the Seymours to the Greys, the Spencers to the Marlboroughs. Each was a brick in the foundation that would centuries later allow Diana to rise as a suitable bride for a future king. Without these quiet arrangements, she might have been another anonymous aristocrat. Instead, she became a princess. Historians still argue whether these marriages truly stabilised the monarchy or merely postponed inevitable conflict. Alliances made through weddings often fractured anyway, with husbands betraying wives, cousins rebelling against cousins, and blood-soaking battlefields regardless of nuptial vows. Yet the belief persisted. A good match could save a dynasty. It was a belief so entrenched that it carried forward into the 20th century, when Charles and Diana's union was orchestrated less as romance and more as a dynastic bargain. Here's another quirky tidbit. In the 17th century, it was common for marriage negotiations to last longer than the actual unions. Families would argue for years over dowries, land rights and titles, only for the bride or groom to die before the wedding ever occurred. Picture the absurdity, haggling for 5 years over which estate comes with the marriage, only to have death swoop in before the vows are said. It's a grim reminder that even the most carefully planned bargains often dissolved in the face of fate. Diana's story, too, proved how little planning can control destiny. You linger now by a tapestry depicting a wedding feast. Musicians play lutes, guests laugh, but look closer. The bride's smile is forced, the groom's eyes are calculating, and the parents look more satisfied than the couple themselves. It's a performance, a contract dressed as celebration. You imagine Diana's own wedding broadcast to millions, a radiant image concealing the cold reality of what that marriage truly meant. Different century, same masquerade. The marriages of convenience also carried risks. A bad union could drag a family into scandal, bankruptcy, or even treason. Take the Howard family again, forever ambitious, forever entangling themselves with royal matches. Their gambles sometimes ended in crowns, more often in scaffolds, yet still they bargained, still they married, still they believed the next alliance might finally secure them. Diana inherited this restless ambition too, not in her personal choices, but in the institution that absorbed her. Forever marrying, forever bargaining, forever searching for stability that never came. Historians still debate whether the monarchy itself survived more through the sword or the marriage bed. Wars decided who held the crown in the moment, but marriages determined who might inherit it decades later. Blood proved more enduring than blades. Diana's blood, by virtue of her descent from these unions, was as royal in its own way as Charles's. Their marriage was not a collision of commoner and prince, but the re-entangling of dynasties separated by centuries. As you step back from the table, the echoes of quills and contracts fade. You realise that the marriages of convenience were not just cold bargains, they were acts of survival. Without them, the bloodlines that shaped Diana would have scattered, perhaps vanished. With them the threads tightened, weaving her into inevitability. Ahead the corridor grows brighter, lined with portraits of powdered wigs and aristocratic elegance. The Spencers enter the stage next, Diana's direct ancestors, their star rising in Stuart and Georgian England. They will build palaces, serve monarchs, and cement themselves as one of the greatest noble houses, and through them, the Tudor and Stuart legacies will find their way into Diana's very heartbeat. You take a deep breath, steadying yourself. For the next chamber will no longer be about the Tudors or Stuarts at the centre of power, but about Diana's own family stepping forward into history. The corridor changes as you step forward. The air no longer reeks of tower damp or Tudor candle wax. It smells faintly of polished oak, fresh plaster, and the dust of long-kept ledgers. You've walked out of the shadowy chambers of kings and into the drawing rooms of noble families, where portraits smile stiffly above mantels, and genealogies are written in neat Latin script. This is the world of the Spencers, Diana's ancestors, and here the story of her bloodline begins to crystallise into something unmistakably her own. You probably wouldn't expect much drama from account books and estates, but lean closer and you'll see. The Spencers were anything but dull. They rose from relatively modest beginnings as wealthy sheep graziers in the 15th century, clever enough to turn wool into gold. While others spilt blood on battlefields, the early Spencers fattened their coffers by supplying England's hunger for cloth. In a country clawing its way out of the Wars of the Roses, money proved safer than swords. By the Tudor age, the family was already nudging its way upward, buying land, securing titles, and marrying well. Historians still argue whether the Spencers' wealth made them resented upstarts or admired innovators. What's certain is that by the time of Henry VIII, they had landed estates sprawling across Northamptonshire. From merchants to squires, and from squires to barons, their climb seemed relentless. You might call it a Tudor-era success story, proof that a family with wits, money and luck could elbow its way into nobility. Diana, centuries later, would inherit this same paradox. Part common touch, part aristocratic glamour. Here's a curious tidbit. Sir John Spencer, one of the earliest patriarchs, was so wealthy that he was called Lord of the Sheep. Imagine the mockery and envy wrapped in that nickname. His fortune in wool was so great that even Elizabeth I once demanded a loan from him, £500,000 in modern money. He refused politely but firmly. Few men told the Virgin Queen no and lived comfortably afterward. But Spencer did, which shows you how much power money wielded even against a throne. Diana's later ability to stand firm against the crown's suffocating expectations carries an uncanny echo of this family stubbornness. You walk through a gallery of Spencer portraits now. The clothes shift with the centuries. Ruffs give way to lace collars to powdered wigs, wigs to sober Georgian coats. Yet the expressions remain similar. Serious, proud, eyes locked on posterity. These are men and women who knew they were climbing, who believed their name would last. They invested not only in land but in visibility. They married strategically, binding themselves to great families. The Churchills, the Cavendishes, the Marlboroughs. Every alliance pulled them higher. And then came Althorp, the great Spencer estate. You can almost see it before you now. A red brick mansion rising from green lawns, deer grazing in the parkland, libraries crammed with books, dining halls echoing with laughter and argument. Built in the 16th century, it became the seat of the family, a symbol of permanence. Walk its halls, and you sense both grandeur and weight, the expectation that generations will be born, raised, and buried under its roof. Diana herself grew up running those lawns, her childhood framed by the very bricks laid by ancestors who had clawed their way into the aristocracy. Historians still debate whether the Spencers were truly accepted by the old nobility, or forever regarded as new money. The truth lies somewhere in between. Their fortune gave them a seat at the table, but their ambition kept them climbing higher, marrying into older families until their name carried weight equal to any duke's. By the 17th century they had woven themselves into the thick fabric of English aristocracy, their lineage brushing shoulders with Tudor and Stuart branches alike. Here's another quirky tidbit. Sir John Spencer once locked his daughter Elizabeth in the family house to prevent her from marrying the man she loved, Lord Compton. The lovers eloped anyway, climbing out a window. The furious father relented only when Queen Elizabeth herself intervened, commanding the marriage to stand. Imagine needing the monarch's permission to secure your love match. You almost laugh, until you remember Diana, centuries later, pleading for compassion in a marriage where love had little room. Same story, new stage. The Spencers thrived under the Stuarts and later under the Hanoverians, always careful to stay close to the crown but not so close as to be singed. They served as courtiers, politicians, generals. One became Lord Treasurer under James I. Another married into the Marlborough line, bringing with it the glory of Blenheim Palace. Diana's family tree brims with these alliances, each a step upward, each tightening the cord between her and the monarchy she would eventually marry into. But there was always a shadow too. The Spencers were known for pride, extravagance, and sometimes scandal. Their wealth bred arrogance, and their marriages sometimes faltered. By the 18th century, pamphleteers mocked them for flaunting riches. Yet even scandal could not unseat them. They endured, a dynasty in their own right. Diana, born into this house centuries later, inherited both its grandeur and its fragility. She grew up in Althorp, but her parents' bitter divorce left scars as deep as any Tudor intrigue. Money and nobility, she learned early, could not shield one from unhappiness. Historians still argue whether the Spencers' rise was due more to fortune or cunning. Perhaps it was both. But what matters for you, wandering these corridors, is the realization that Diana's story was centuries in the making. She was not some accidental commoner. plucked from obscurity to marry Charles. She was the product of generations of careful marriages, relentless ambition, and calculated survival. The Tudors and Stuarts gave the blood, the Spencers gave the Polish. You pause before a portrait of George John Spencer, 2nd Earl Spencer, an avid book collector. His library at Althorpe was legendary, one of the greatest private collections in Europe. He spent fortunes on rare manuscripts, binding knowledge in leather as tightly as his ancestors bound themselves to dynastic bargains. Diana, centuries later, would be photographed with books in her lap, her own thirst for knowledge often underestimated. The echo is faint but real. The family prized not only wealth, but culture. And then there was Charles Spencer, 3rd Duke of Marlborough, Diana's ancestor through the Churchill line. His military exploits and political manoeuvres tied the family further to the great houses of Europe. By the 19th century, the Spencers were no longer sheep farmers' heirs. They were dukes, earls, courtiers, confidants of monarchs. Diana was born into this glittering but weighty legacy, a girl raised on fairy tale lawns but destined for something darker. Here's one last tidbit before you leave this gallery. The Spencers kept a family motto, Dieu défend le droit, God defends the right. It sounds noble, but you sense the irony. For centuries, their rise depended less on divine defence than on shrewd marriages, clever investments, and sheer determination. Diana, who would later be cast as the embodiment of goodness and compassion, inherited that motto too, and yet, like her ancestors, she would discover that divine protection is fickle when set against human ambition. The corridor darkens again as you leave Althorpe's imagined halls. You carry with you the scent of sheep-wool fortune, the echoes of elopements, the rustle of books, the clink of goblets filled with wine paid for by wool. Ahead, the air grows heavier, tinged with something darker, whispers of madness, of hereditary melancholy, of fragility passed down through blood as surely as titles and estates. For the next stage of Diana's legacy is not just grandeur, but shadow. The corridor tilts as though the stones themselves have grown weary, and you feel the shift immediately. The air grows close, the torchlight dulls, and the portraits on the wall seem to stare with eyes that flicker not with pride but with sadness. This is not the triumphant world of marriages and estates. This is the quieter, more insidious legacy that winds its way through Diana's bloodline. The inheritance of fragility, madness, melancholy, and sudden catastrophe haunt these halls as surely as crowns and coronets. You probably wouldn't survive long in this space either, for here even silence feels heavy. The Tudors had their curses, the Stuarts their beheadings, but the Spencers and their noble kin often carried burdens that came from within, the cracks in the mind, the shadows in the spirit. And Diana, centuries later, bore those same shadows. Begin with the Tudors themselves. Henry VI of Lancaster, though not a Tudor, married into the Yorkist web that the Tudors would later inherit, was famously prone to catatonic breakdowns, unable to speak or recognise those around him. This fragility paved the way for the Wars of the Roses, the very conflict the Tudors rose out of. The warning was clear: a dynasty's survival could hinge not just on swords, but on sanity. The Tudors learned to fear instability, yet they could never fully outrun it. Henry VIII, often portrayed as blustering and tyrannical, showed bursts of paranoia and mood swings so violent that some modern scholars suggest he may have suffered from traumatic brain injury after a jousting accident. His heirs, too, bore strange shadows: Mary the Run's phantom pregnancies, Elizabeth's lifelong anxieties. The family carried within it both brilliance and brittleness. And then the Stuarts. James I, who inherited Elizabeth's crown, obsessed over witches and demons, a fixation bordering on mania. His son Charles I, stubborn to the point of destruction, chose death rather than compromise. Later, George III, a descendant through the Hanoverian succession, suffered notorious bouts of madness, likely porphyria, that left him babbling incoherently, sometimes foaming at the mouth, other times weeping uncontrollably. His condition became a national spectacle, with newspapers gossiping about the king's lunacy as openly as tabloids once gossiped about Diana's struggles. Here's a curious tidbit. During one of George III's episodes, he is said to have shaken hands with a tree in Windsor Great Park, believing it to be the King of Prussia. Imagine a monarch reduced to mistaking oak for royalty. The public laughed, but beneath the jest was fear, If a king could lose his mind, what hope was there for the nation? That fear of instability in the highest places echoes centuries later in the whispers about Diana's fragility, her bulimia, her depression, her own admissions that she was at times overwhelmed by shadows. Historians still argue whether Diana's struggles were inherited threads of melancholy or the result of her environment. But the pattern is undeniable. Her lineage was full of men and women burdened by emotional turbulence. The Spencer family itself was not immune. Generations of Spencers carried reputations for eccentricity, pride, or instability. John Spencer, Diana's own father, was known for both charm and melancholy, while her mother's struggles with motherhood left scars that rippled down to Diana's childhood. She grew up knowing that aristocratic grandeur was no shield against private despair, and it was not just kings and earls. Noble women too bore the weight of inherited melancholy. Catherine Grey, imprisoned by Elizabeth I, wasted away in isolation, her letters filled with despair. Mary, Queen of Scots, tall and luminous, spent 19 years in captivity, writing poetry that drips with longing and sorrow. These voices linger in the corridors, reminding you that royal bloodlines carried not only wealth and power, but despair woven like a dark thread through generations. Here's another eerie detail. Physicians of the 17th and 18th centuries often diagnosed melancholia in aristocrats, believing that their sedentary lives and excessive black bile predisposed them to sadness. Treatments included leeches, purges, and confinement in country estates for rest. Imagine trying to bleed away grief with a knife. Diana, centuries later, would be offered her own versions of these cures: therapy, seclusion, rigid expectations, none of which could truly heal the deeper wound of isolation within an unforgiving system. The legacy of madness also carried a political cost. The instability of kings invited coups and revolutions. George III's breakdowns paved the way for his son, the flamboyant and irresponsible Prince Regent, to assume power. Madness reshaped the monarchy itself. Diana's breakdowns, however different in scale, reshaped the monarchy too. Her candid interviews, her confessions of loneliness, forced the royal family into the modern age of vulnerability and public empathy. In both cases, private fragility became public spectacle. Historians still argue whether we should view these breakdowns as tragedy or transformation. Did they weaken the monarchy or humanize it? Perhaps both. George III is remembered as the mad king who lost America, yet also as a man who suffered nobly. Diana is remembered as the sad princess who conquered hearts, her fragility not diminishing her legacy but magnifying it. In this pattern, you sense the deep continuity of her bloodline, instability turned into myth, sorrow transfigured into symbol. You wander now into a smaller chamber, dimmer, quieter. On a desk lies a pile of letters, spidery handwriting spilling confessions of grief, prayers for strength, fears of damnation. These could be written by Catherine Grey in the Tower, by George III in Windsor, or by Diana herself decades later. The content barely changes. The crushing weight of duty, the loneliness of confinement, the desperate need for compassion. You run your fingers over the faded ink and feel the centuries collapse into one long sigh. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you pause. George II's queen, Caroline of Ansbach, insisted on attending lectures on anatomy and medicine, fascinated by the workings of the human body. She asked to see dissections, trying to understand what made people suffer. Her curiosity scandalized courtiers, but it reminds you that royal women often searched for answers about madness and sorrow in ways their husbands never dared. Diana too searched, reading psychology, speaking to doctors, and eventually speaking to the world. And so you realize, the echo of madness and melancholy in Diana's bloodline was not simply curse but catalyst. It drove reform, confession, change. Monarchs with fragile minds forced institutions to adapt. Princesses with fragile hearts forced families to soften. The sorrow that haunted them also reshaped history. As you leave this chamber, the portraits on the wall blur together. Henry with his paranoia, Mary with her phantom grief, Elizabeth with her anxious vigilance, George with his wild eyes, and faintest but clearest, Diana with her soft voice confessing to the world, "I was crying out for help. The inheritance is unmistakable and unbearably heavy." The corridor ahead brightens again, and you hear the murmur of courtiers negotiating once more. But this time it is not just about alliances or dowries. It is about survival itself, the fragile bargain between monarchy and its people, between private sorrow and public duty. Diana's bloodline has carried her this far, and now it must reckon with the crown's fragile bargain. The corridor opens again, wide and echoing, and for the first time you sense that the stones beneath your feet are less like prison walls, and more like a balancing beam stretched across a chasm. Every step feels uncertain. This is where Diana's ancestry leads you now, not to a single monarch's glory or a noble house's ambition, but to the uneasy bargain struck between crown and subject, between tradition and survival. For the Tudors, for the Stuarts, for the Spencers, and ultimately for Diana, the monarchy itself has always existed on fragile terms, adored by the people, distrusted by its own members, and forever dependent on whether the bargain still felt worth keeping. You probably wouldn't last long at such a bargain table. Imagine the pressure, millions of eyes weighing your every move, your family's entire history riding on whether you smile, whether you marry correctly, whether you produce the right heirs. This is monarchy stripped of romance, reduced to an ongoing negotiation between survival and collapse. The Tudors understood this all too well. Henry VII's bargain with the people was simple: peace after decades of war. He gave them stability, and in return they gave him their reluctant loyalty. Henry VIII's bargain was bolder. He gave England sovereignty against Rome, and in exchange demanded absolute obedience. Elizabeth I's bargain was subtler still. She gave the people glory, empire, theatre and pride in exchange for their acceptance of her celibacy and solitude. Each monarch understood the deal could never be permanent. It always needed renegotiation. The Stuarts inherited this fragility. James I demanded divine right, but conceded to Parliament when it suited him. Charles I refused to bend, and the axe fell. Charles II seduced the public with revelry and spectacle after years of Puritan gloom, while James II lost the crown entirely when the bargain snapped. Again and again, the monarchy's survival was not divine inevitability but a precarious contract with the people. Diana, centuries later, stepped into the same contract, except the currency had changed. No longer wars and treaties, but television cameras and tabloid headlines. She gave the people openness and humanity. In return, they gave her adoration, sometimes even worship. But the crown itself, suspicious and rigid, resented how fully she embodied the bargain. Historians still argue whether monarchy is sustained more by tradition or adaptation. What's certain is that it survives only so long as people agree to the illusion of its permanence. Without that, the crown becomes just metal, the throne just wood. Diana instinctively understood this fragility. Her charm, her empathy, her willingness to cry in public, all renegotiated the terms. She reminded the people why they still cared. But by doing so, she unsettled the palace, which preferred silence and stoicism. Here's a curious tidbit. In the 18th century, the Spencers themselves became part of this fragile bargain. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, Diana's formidable ancestor, was the closest confidant of Queen Anne. For years, she all but ruled the court, whispering in the Queen's ear. But when Anne tired of her imperiousness, Sarah was cast aside. Her influence evaporated overnight. One moment indispensable, the next discarded. That is the bargain. Diana's own experience with Charles with the Windsors mirrored this arc. At first adored, then feared, then marginalised. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes with painful precision. And the bargain was not only about individuals, it was about heirs, always heirs. The crown's very survival depended on producing them, and producing them in the right way. The Tudors shattered England in their desperation for heirs. The Stuarts invited wars of succession when heirs were disputed. The Hanoverians imported entire families to keep the line intact. And when Diana married Charles, the unspoken bargain was clear: give us sons, secure the dynasty, and in return you will be cherished. She gave them William and Harry, two healthy boys adored by the public. And yet the bargain still faltered. The monarchy took what it needed and offered little in return. Historians still argue whether Diana's popularity saved or endangered the monarchy. Some claim she breathed new life into an institution that felt dusty and irrelevant. Others say she overshadowed it, making the crown itself seem cold and out of touch. Perhaps both are true. What matters is that her story reveals the same fragile bargain her ancestors lived under. The crown is adored only as long as it delivers something the people desire. The moment it falters, it teeters. You walk now into a chamber filled with mirrors. In each one you see a different bargain reflected. Henry VII promising peace, Elizabeth promising glory, Charles I refusing to bend, George III shaking hands with trees, his bargain mocked by the people, and there, faint but clear, Diana smiling through tears, giving the people vulnerability in exchange for love. Each reflection flickers like a candle flame, and you realise the monarchy itself is nothing more than this series of bargains, constantly renewed, constantly at risk. Here's a quirky echo. In the 19th century, Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert redefined the bargain again. She projected domestic virtue, presenting the monarchy as a model family. It worked. People adored the image of a loving queen and her consort. But after Albert's death, Victoria withdrew into mourning, breaking the bargain. For decades, she hid from the public and her popularity plummeted. Diana's story is almost the inversion. Her marriage faltered, but instead of retreating, she stepped forward into the public eye, giving them the family warmth the Windsors could not. And so the fragile bargain becomes the through line. It explains why monarchies rise and fall, why noble families survive or vanish, why Diana's story resonates so powerfully. The crown is never absolute. It always rests on consent given grudgingly, lovingly or resentfully, but always given. And when that consent frays, blood is spilled, whether on tower scaffolds or Parisian tunnels. As you leave the Hall of Mirrors, the torchlight dims again. Ahead, you sense a more personal chamber waiting, one where Diana herself comes fully into focus. You've traced her ancestry through Tudors, Stuarts, Howards and Spencers, through curses and bargains and ambitions. But now the corridor bends toward her directly. The next chamber is not about kings and queens of centuries past. It is about Diana herself, standing as a living reflection of all the echoes before her. You steady your breath. The bargain has been fragile for centuries. In Diana, it becomes flesh again. The corridor narrows again, and now the shadows gather into a single figure. No more flickering ghosts of Henry or Elizabeth, no more whispers of grey sisters or Stuart kings. Here, the candlelight steadies, and there she stands, Diana, radiant yet fragile, her presence unmistakable. For 16 sections, you've been walking through centuries of ancestors, through curses, bargains, marriages, and madness. And now the bloodline resolves itself in her, the Tudor heir not in crown or title, but in spirit, in tragedy, in the way she embodied everything that haunted and illuminated her forebears. She smiles at you, shy and luminous, the same way she once smiled from beneath a feathered hat on the day her engagement was announced. Yet behind the softness is steel inherited from Margaret Tudor's stubbornness, from Anne Boleyn's defiance, from Elizabeth's solitude. Diana carries them all, and in her story the Tudor legacy flares up one last time, centuries after the dynasty supposedly died. You probably wouldn't survive a single day in her skin. The pressure of cameras alone would crush you. In Tudor times, courtiers judged every word you whispered. In Diana's age, it was paparazzi lenses, tabloids, and global broadcasts. Both systems demanded perfection, both punished imperfection, and both devoured their icons when the mask slipped. Diana was the Tudor queen reborn, only without the crown's protections. Historians still argue what exactly made her so magnetic. Was it her beauty, her compassion, her vulnerability, or was it that she seemed to resurrect something older? The myth of the tragic royal woman who speaks to the people, even as the palace conspires against her. Anne Boleyn had done it, Elizabeth had perfected it, Mary Stuart had died for it. Diana simply modernised it. Here's a curious tidbit. Diana's wedding dress in 1981 was deliberately designed with Tudor echoes. The vast puffed sleeves and dramatic train resembled the exaggerated silhouettes of Tudor gowns, while her veil shimmered like a queen's canopy. The world saw a fairy tale bride, but to historians the symbolism was unmistakable. She was stepping into a dynasty centuries older than Windsor, carrying on a role defined by ancestors who had lived and died by similar bargains. But her life inside the palace quickly revealed the Tudor curse. Like Catherine of Aragon, she was defined by her ability to bear heirs. Like Anne Boleyn, she was scrutinised, suspected, whispered about when her marriage faltered. Like Jane Seymour, she was idolised in public but crushed in private. And like Elizabeth I, she wielded charisma so dazzling that it made others tremble. Each Tudor queen's fate lived again in her. Twisted into modern form, you walk with her through the glittering halls of Buckingham Palace. The chandeliers sparkle, the carpets muffle every step, but the air is colder than you expect. She once described it herself. There's no warmth there. You can feel it now, the same chill that haunted Elizabeth in her childless chambers, the same loneliness that consumed Mary Queen of Scots in captivity. Diana, though adored by millions, often ate dinner alone, the silence pressing in. Historians still argue whether Diana understood her own ancestry. Did she know the depth of Tudor echoes in her blood? Perhaps not in detail, but she felt it in essence. She often spoke of feeling like a lamb to the slaughter on her wedding day. That phrase could have been uttered by Jane Grey, walking to the block, or Catherine Howard, practicing how to kneel before the axe. Diana's intuition told her she was reenacting an old story, whether she could name it or not. Here's another eerie echo. Diana loved Althorpe, her family estate, but she once said she felt like she was always on the edge, never quite at home. Elizabeth had said something similar about court life. Always adored, never safe. To belong halfway and never fully, that is the Tudor inheritance. And then there were the prophecies. Just as Tudors clung to astrologers and omens, Diana too leaned into intuition. Friends recall her saying she felt she wouldn't live past 40. Psychics told her she would die young. She confessed to astrologers her fears of being hunted by forces beyond her control. When she died at 36, the whispers of Tudor curses flared anew. Was it fate, blood, or the relentless machinery of monarchy that ended her? Historians still argue whether her death was pure accident or the result of darker forces. But in the sweep of her ancestry, the specifics almost don't matter. What matters is that her fate fit the pattern too perfectly. A dazzling woman raised high, cut down too soon, leaving a legacy that outshone those who survived her. That is the Tudor script. You pause in front of her image now, not in oil paint, but in photographs. She hugs AIDS patients without gloves, shaking the world's prejudice. She kneels to comfort children, breaking royal protocol. She steps out of cars in gowns that shimmer like armour. Every gesture echoes her ancestors. Elizabeth I used pageantry to project majesty. Diana used empathy. Anne Boleyn wielded charm as a weapon. Diana wielded vulnerability. Both rewrote what it meant to be royal women. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you smile sadly. Diana once wore a necklace given by the Queen that spelled the Queen's pendant. Instead of wearing it as intended, she looped it across her forehead like a tiara to the horror of traditionalists. It was pure Tudor defiance. Anne Boleyn would have applauded, Elizabeth would have smirked. Even in fashion, she was rewriting the rules. But like the Tudors before her, Diana's light threatened the institution she served. Henry VIII destroyed queens when they overshadowed him. Elizabeth destroyed suitors when they threatened her autonomy. Diana's in-laws tried to contain her, sideline her, silence her. They forgot, or perhaps remembered too well, that Tudor women never stayed silent. Historians still argue whether Diana's true legacy was her humanitarian work, her challenge to monarchy, or her role as mother to William and Harry. Perhaps it is all three. But tonight, in this corridor of ancestry, you see her most clearly as the last great Tudor. Not by crown, not by surname, but by spirit. The same charisma, the same peril, the same tragic brilliance. As you step back, her figure begins to fade, but her presence lingers stronger than any Tudor ghost before her. For while their stories ended in scaffolds and solitude, hers ended in a Paris tunnel, the modern scaffold of flashing bulbs and relentless pursuit. And yet, like them, her death transformed her into myth. She is now more than princess, more than woman. She is legend, a ghost forever walking the line between love and destruction. The corridor grows softer now, the shadows easing. Ahead lies the final chamber, where all these strands, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Spencers, the bargains, the curses, will weave together into one last reflection. The journey is nearly at its end. The corridor shifts for the last time, and now you find yourself walking not among stone walls and flickering torches, but beneath neon lights, camera flashes, and the hum of engines echoing off Parisian tunnels. The air is sharper, modern, but the shadows remain. They are not the whispers of Tudor priests or the rustle of Stuart courtiers, but the click of shutters, the scribble of journalists, the roar of a public hungry for every glimpse of a woman who carried centuries in her veins. You are in Diana's world now, modern, global, yet unmistakably haunted by echoes that stretch back through every Tudor chamber you've walked before. She is everywhere here, on magazine covers, in shop windows, on televisions, in pubs. Diana became not just a princess, but a symbol, and in this transformation you feel the heavy hand of history pressing down. She was never allowed to be simply herself. Like Anne Boleyn, like Elizabeth I, like Mary Stuart, she became a canvas on which a nation, and indeed the world, painted its desires, its fears, its hopes. Her blood carried the ancient weight of Tudors and Spencers, but her life was lived in the glare of cameras rather than candlelight. The continuity is uncanny. You probably wouldn't survive long in this space either. The pressure is relentless, harsher even than the Tudor court. Courtiers could whisper and plot, but they didn't have telephoto lenses recording every stumble, every smile, every tear. Diana lived under a magnifying glass so bright it burned. The Tudors endured rumour, she endured broadcast. Yet the pattern is the same: scrutiny as a weapon, spectacle as survival. Historians still argue what Diana truly meant. Was she a rebel against monarchy, or its most faithful servant in a new age? Did she save the crown by making it human, or endanger it by showing how fragile it truly was? The debates mirror those about her ancestors. Was Anne Boleyn a martyr or a schemer? Was Elizabeth a saviour or a tyrant? Was Mary Stuart naive or tragic? Diana belongs in that same hall of contested figures, loved, judged, mythologized. Here's a curious tidbit. In her famous BBC Panorama interview in 1995, Diana sat in a simple black suit, speaking softly, her eyes lowered but her words razor sharp. It was a moment of spectacle as potent as Henry VIII's break with Rome, as radical as Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury. She told the world, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." That single line shattered the illusion of royal perfection. It was the modern equivalent of Anne Boleyn refusing to yield, of Elizabeth refusing to marry. A woman standing alone, vulnerable but unbending. And then there was her death. The car crash in Paris in 1997 felt less like an accident, and more like the final act of a Tudor tragedy rewritten in steel and concrete. A queen might have walked to a scaffold. Diana sped through a tunnel. Both met the same end. Adored by the people, destroyed by the system. The flowers outside Kensington Palace piled like the roses once scattered on Tower Green. The public wept as though a monarch had fallen, and in a sense, one had. Historians still argue whether Diana's death marked the beginning of the monarchy's decline or its reluctant modernisation. The outpouring of grief shocked the Windsors into change, forcing them to step down from their aloof pedestal. Elizabeth II, silent at first, bowed her head before Diana's coffin, a gesture as seismic as any coronation. It was the fragile bargain of monarchy renegotiated yet again, with Diana's ghost as mediator. Here's another echo. The sons she bore, William and Harry, carry forward not just Windsor blood, but Spencer blood, Tudor blood, Stuart blood. Through them, Diana's legacy continues, a reminder that the monarchy is never just one family, but an accumulation of centuries of bargains and burdens. William, destined for the throne, carries the Tudor charisma with a quieter restraint. Harry, rebellious and outspoken, carries the Tudor defiance with raw emotion. Both are her echoes, as Elizabeth was Anne's, as James was Mary Stuart's. You linger before a modern shrine, candles guttering outside Kensington Palace, teddy bears left by children, handwritten notes trembling in the wind. It is not unlike the chapels of the Tudors, where pilgrims left offerings before tombs. Humanity changes its tools, not its impulses. We mourn our queens the same way, whether beneath stained glass or streetlights. Diana became the saint of modern sorrow, her image haloed not by gold leaf, but by camera flash. Here's a quirky tidbit. In 1985, Diana danced with John Travolta at the White House, wearing a midnight blue gown. The photographs circled the globe, showing her as glamorous, untouchable. Yet behind the sequins, Her marriage was collapsing. The Tudors would have understood perfectly. Elizabeth danced at court while fearing plots. Anne dazzled Henry at feasts while her enemies sharpened blades. Diana's dance was part of the same performance, a smile masking the knife's shadow. The echoes in modern shadows are everywhere. When Diana confessed her struggles with bulimia, she broke a centuries-old silence. Tudor queens starved themselves in despair. Stuart queens wept in isolation. None could ever speak. Diana spoke, and the world listened. That was her rebellion, her inheritance, her gift. Historians still argue whether we should see Diana as victim or victor. Perhaps she was both. She did not escape tragedy, but she transformed it into a legacy that endures. Like Anne, like Elizabeth, like Mary, she became myth. The monarchy, for all its resistance, will never outgrow her shadow. You step now into the corridor's final quiet. The echoes soften, the air grows still. Behind you, centuries of ghosts fall silent. Ahead, the path leads not to another chamber of tragedy, but to rest. Diana's story, like the Tudors, has been told, and now it can settle into memory. So now, as you sit with the story's weight, let the pace slow. You've walked through cold towers and bright halls, through whispered curses and shouted bargains, and at the end of it all you found her, Diana, the last great Tudor spirit. The echoes that haunted her life were never truly hers alone. They came from centuries of women and men bound by crowns, contracts, and cages of expectation. But here, at the close of night, those echoes fade. The Tudor queens who walked to the scaffold, the Stuart kings who stumbled through revolution, the Spencers who built their fortune from wool and stubbornness, all drift now into a softer silence. Even Diana herself, smiling shyly, seems less weighed down, more at peace. Picture her not in the flash of paparazzi bulbs or in the roar of royal crowds, but on the island at Althorpe. The water laps quietly around the trees, swans glide across the surface, and the air hums with crickets. Here she is no longer the hunted princess, no longer the tragic heir of Tudor curses, but simply Diana, mother, daughter, friend. The shadows recede, the history stills. Let your breathing lengthen as you sit in this calm. The storm of ambition and betrayal is behind you now. Ahead lies only the hush of night, the comfort of rest, and so our journey ends. You've traced 1,000 years of power and sorrow, seen how Tudor ambition became Spencer pride, how Stuart bargain shaped Windsor heirs, and how all of it flowed into one luminous woman. Diana's story was never separate. It was always part of this tapestry.